He would one day be buried in Canaan by the son whose birth had once seemed impossible. But when his journey began, he possessed no grave there, no field, no permanent home, and no child to carry his name. He had only a command to leave, a promise too large to verify, and a road leading away from everything his family had known. Before he was Abraham, he was Abram. His family lived in Ur of the Chaldeans. His father was Terah, and Terah had 3 sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. The family was already marked by a death that changed its shape. Haran died in Ur, the land of his birth, while his father Terah was still alive. He left behind a son named Lot, along with 2 daughters, Milcah and Iscah. That made Lot the son of a dead brother and the grandson of Terah. He would remain closely tied to Abram, traveling with him long after the rest of the family stopped. The bond mattered because Abram had no son of his own. Abram married Sarai. His brother Nahor married Milcah, Haran's daughter. The family line continued through one branch, but not through Abram and Sarai. Sarai was barren. She had no child. That fact stood quietly beside everything that followed. Before any promise of descendants was given, before any land was shown, Abram and Sarai were already living with the absence of an heir. There was no son waiting to inherit, no daughter in their household, and no indication that their condition was about to change. Then Terah gathered part of his family and left Ur. He took Abram, he took Sarai, his daughter-in-law, and he took Lot, the son Haran had left behind. Their intended destination was Canaan. The movement did not begin with Abram alone responding to a private call. It began as a family migration led by Terah, setting out from Ur toward another land. But they did not reach Canaan. They came to Haran and settled there. The journey that had begun with Canaan as its destination stopped before Canaan was reached. Haran became the place where Terah's migration ended and where the remaining families stayed together for a time. Terah died there at the age of 205. His death created another dividing line in the family. Haran the son had died back in Ur. Now Terah the father died in the place that bore the same name. Abram remained with Sarai, still without a child, and Lot remained the son of Abram's dead brother. The first movement toward Canaan had ended without arriving, and the man who had led it would go no farther. It was in this setting that the Lord spoke to Abram. The command began with separation. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Abram was not initially given a named destination. Canaan had been Terah's intended destination, but the command now required Abram to move under a different condition. The land would be shown to him by the God who was sending him. He was to leave his country, detach himself from the larger network of his relatives, and move beyond his father's household. Each part of the command narrowed what Abram could take for granted. Country, kindred, and father's house described the world from which his identity and place had come. The destination was described only as the land God would show him. The command was joined to a series of promises. God would make Abram into a great nation. He would bless him. He would make Abram's name great, and Abram would become a blessing. Those who blessed him would be blessed. The one who treated him with contempt would be cursed. And through Abram, all the families of the earth would be blessed. The scale of those promises stood in direct contrast to Abram's visible circumstances. A great nation was promised to a man whose wife had no child. A great name was promised to a man being told to leave the place where his family was known. Worldwide blessing was attached to someone who was about to become a traveler in a land that had not yet been identified to him. Nothing in Abram's household had changed before he had to act. Sarai had not conceived, a territory had not been transferred to him. The promises came first, and the departure had to follow, while their fulfillment remained unseen. Abram went as the Lord had told him. He was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. The age matters, because this was not the first venture of a young man beginning an independent life. Abram had spent decades within Terah's family, had traveled from Ur to Haran under his father's leadership, and had remained there until the journey began again. Now he took responsibility for the movement that Terah had not completed. Lot went with him. The command had required Abram to leave his kindred and his father's house, but it did not leave him traveling without a household. Sarai accompanied him as his wife. Lot accompanied him as his dead brother's son. Abram also took the possessions they had accumulated in Haran and the people they had acquired there. This was a substantial departure. Abram was not carrying only what one man could hold. He was moving a household, its possessions and its people. Haran had not merely been a stopping place on a road. It had been a place where Abram's household had grown in property and number, even while the central absence remained unchanged. He had people with him, but no child born to Sarai. He had possessions, but no part of the promised land. They set out for Canaan. This time, they arrived. Abram entered a land already occupied by others. He passed through it as far as the site of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. The Canaanites were then in the land. That simple reality defined his position from the beginning. Canaan was not waiting empty for him. Abram entered as a newcomer among a people already established there. He had obeyed the command to go, but arrival did not amount to possession. No city was handed over to him. No boundary was cleared for his household. He stood in the land as a traveler with Sarai, Lot, his servants, and his goods, surrounded by those who already lived there. At Shechem, the Lord appeared to him. The promise now became geographically specific. To your offspring I will give this land. Abram had reached the place God intended to show him, and God identified it as the future inheritance of his offspring. Yet the promise still joined two things Abram did not possess. The land belonged to the Canaanites, and the offspring did not yet exist. The word pointed beyond Abram's present condition. He himself was standing in Canaan, but the land was promised to his descendants. Sarai was still barren, but God spoke of Abram's offspring as the people to whom the land would be given. Abram responded by building an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. The first structure associated with Abram in Canaan was not a house, a wall, or a claim of ownership. It was an altar. It marked the place where God had appeared and attached the land promised to Abram's future descendants. Then Abram moved on. From Shechem, he went to the hill country east of Bethel. There he pitched his tent, with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. The tent suited his position. He was in the land, but he was not established as its ruler or owner. His dwelling could be razed, taken down, and carried farther. At that location, Abram built another altar to the Lord. He called upon the name of the Lord there. The movement and the altars formed the first pattern of his life in Canaan. He traveled through territory he had been promised but did not control. At important points he stopped and worshipped. Then he moved again. Nothing had yet removed the central tension. Abram's obedience had brought him into Canaan, but it had not produced immediate fulfillment. The land was real, the Canaanites were real, the promise was real, the possession remained future. And Sarai still had no child. The promise of a great nation depended upon descendants. The promise of land had now been directed specifically toward Abram's offspring. The promise that all families of the earth would be blessed through him required a future larger than the household that had left Haran. Yet Abram's family line still rested on a marriage without children and on words that only God could fulfill. Abram did not remain beside the altar near Bethel. He continued traveling by stages toward the Negeb. This was no triumphant entrance, followed by immediate settlement. His first passage through Canaan was movement from place to place, into the land, through Shechem, toward the hill country, and then farther south. The destination had been reached, but the journey had not ended. That distinction defined Abram's new life. He was no longer in Ur. Terror was no longer leading him. Haran and his father's house were behind him. The command had been obeyed, and the land had been shown. But the visible result was still a man moving through another people's country with a barren wife and a promise concerning children who had not been born. Abram had received no schedule for the making of the great nation. He had received no explanation of how Sarai's barrenness would be overcome. He had received no transfer of Canaan into his possession. What he had received was God's commitment, a land for his offspring, a great name, divine protection within the relationships forming around him, and a blessing meant to reach every family of the earth. For the first time, the future of that blessing was tied to a particular man moving through a particular land. Abram's household had crossed the boundary into Canaan, and every event that followed would test the relationship between what Abram could see and what God had promised. He had left one established place and entered another without becoming established there. He had separated from his father's house while carrying his nephew Lot with him. He had gained possessions and people, but not the son on whom the promise now seemed to depend. He had built altars in a land he could not yet call his own. The first journey had therefore accomplished exactly what the command required, but no more. Abram was where he had been sent. The unanswered questions had traveled with him. Could a childless household become a nation? Could a foreign sojourner receive a land already inhabited? Could one man's obedience become a blessing to families far beyond his own? Abram continued toward the Negev with those questions still open. He had arrived in the land of promise. He had not yet learned how difficult it would be to remain there. The pressure came from the land itself. A famine struck Canaan, and it was severe. Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a time. The land he had been shown could not sustain him through the famine, so he crossed another boundary as a sojourner seeking survival. Before entering Egypt, Abram spoke to Sarai about the danger he expected. He knew that she was a beautiful woman. When the Egyptians saw her, he said, they would identify her as his wife. Then they would kill him and let her live. His answer was to conceal the marriage. He asked Sarai to say that she was his sister, so that he would be treated well because of her and his life would be spared. The plan depended on the Egyptians seeing Sarai exactly as Abram expected, while remaining ignorant of the relationship that placed her under his protection as his wife. It sought to preserve Abram by exposing Sarai. If another man desired her, Abram would no longer appear to be the husband standing in the way. When Abram entered Egypt, the expected attention came quickly. The Egyptians saw that Sarai was very beautiful. Pharaoh's princes saw her as well, and they praised her to Pharaoh. Then Sarai was taken into Pharaoh's house. Abram's fear for his own life had shaped the plan, but the first visible consequence was Sarai's removal. The woman through whom Abram's household continued was now inside another man's house, and Pharaoh had received her without knowing that she was Abram's wife. Abram, meanwhile, was treated well because of her. He received sheep, cattle, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. The strategy appeared to produce the result Abram had requested from Sarai. His life was preserved and his possessions increased. Yet the wealth came while his marriage had been concealed and his wife had been taken. The promise given in Canaan had already been placed under pressure by famine. Now the household at the center of that promise had been divided by Abram's own plan. The danger was no longer only that Abram might die. Sarai had been absorbed into Pharaoh's house under a false understanding of who she was. The reversal came through an action Pharaoh had not anticipated. The Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. The judgment identified the relationship Abram had hidden. Sarai belonged with Abram, and Pharaoh's ignorance did not allow the arrangement to continue. Pharaoh summoned Abram. His questions showed that he now understood what had been concealed. "What is this you have done to me?" he demanded. "Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She is my sister,' so that I took her for my wife?" The danger had turned completely around. Abram had entered Egypt expecting that knowledge of his marriage would provoke his death. Instead, concealment of the marriage had brought judgment upon Pharaoh's house. The ruler Abram feared was now confronting him because the plan intended to keep Abram safe had endangered others. Pharaoh did not order Abram's death. He returned Sarai. "Here is your wife," he said. "Take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave his men orders concerning Abram. They sent him away with Sarai and everything he possessed. Abram left Egypt alive, just as he had wanted. Sarai left with him, restored to his household. The possessions Abram had received were carried out as well. But the deliverance had not come from the deception. The deception had created the crisis. The Lord's intervention had ended it. Egypt had preserved the household through the famine and increased Abram's wealth, but it had also revealed how quickly fear could turn the promise into a problem Abram tried to manage through concealment. The man called to become a blessing had brought affliction upon Pharaoh's house. The foreign ruler had been the one to expose the wrong and send Sarai back. From Egypt, Abram went up into the Negeb. Sarai was with him. Everything he possessed traveled with them, and Lot was there too. Abram was now very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. The material outcome of Egypt followed him back into Canaan. He had first entered the land with the possessions acquired in Haran. He returned from Egypt with even greater wealth. He traveled by stages from the Negeb toward Bethel, returning to the place where his tent had stood at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai. The altar he had made during his first passage through the land was there. At that altar, Abram again called upon the name of the Lord. The return brought him geographically back to an earlier point in his journey. He had left that region moving south, entered Egypt because of famine, and now came back with Sarai, Lot, and expanded possessions. The promise had survived the danger in Egypt, but the increase in wealth created a different kind of pressure inside the traveling household. Lot also possessed flocks, herds, and tents. The land could not support Abram and Lot while they stayed together. Their possessions had become so great that they could no longer dwell in the same place. The abundance that marked their survival now made continued proximity unworkable. Conflict arose between the herdsmen caring for Abram's livestock and the herdsmen caring for Lot's livestock. This was not a private disagreement that could remain contained between two owners. Their animals required space, and the people responsible for them were now in strife. Abram and Lot were also living in a land occupied by the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Their growing households were not dividing an empty territory between them. Abram acted before the conflict divided the family by force. He spoke directly to Lot. "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are brothers." Abram appealed to their kinship even as he proposed separation. They would not preserve peace by continuing to occupy land that could not support both households. Peace now required distance. He placed the choice before Lot. "Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." Abram did not reserve the visibly preferable region for himself. He allowed Lot to choose first and committed himself to take the opposite direction. The land had been promised to Abram's offspring, yet Abram did not secure his future by denying Lot the choice. He sought an end to the strife and left the division of territory open. Lot lifted his eyes and surveyed the Jordan Valley. The valley was well watered everywhere. This was before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. The region appeared like the garden of the Lord and like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. The comparison carried the force of what Lot could see. He had traveled through famine-stricken Canaan and had gone down into Egypt with Abram. Now the Jordan Valley offered abundant water. Faced with a choice created by the needs of their livestock, Lot selected the region that appeared able to sustain his wealth. He chose the entire Jordan Valley for himself. Lot journeyed east, and the two men separated. Their shared movement had begun before Canaan. Lot had left Haran with Abram, crossed into the land with him, gone down into Egypt with him, and returned with him. He was Abram's brother's son, and he had remained within Abram's traveling household through each change. Now their possessions forced a division that danger and distance had not produced. Abram settled in the land of Canaan. Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. The choice placed them in different settings. Abram remained in the land to which he had been called. Lot associated his household with the cities of the plain, bringing his tents close to Sodom. The men of Sodom were wicked and great sinners against the Lord. Lot had chosen according to the water and fertility visible across the valley. The moral condition of the city now beside him was also real. His decision solved the immediate conflict over land and livestock, but it placed his household near people whose wickedness would shape everything that happened to him there. For Abram, the separation carried another consequence. Lot had been the younger relative who traveled with him, while Abram and Sarai remained without a child. Lot's departure left Abram's own household more sharply defined. The nephew who had followed him from Haran had chosen his portion and moved east. After Lot separated from him, the Lord spoke to Abram again. "Lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward." Lot had lifted his eyes and chosen the Jordan Valley. Now Abram was told to lift his eyes after the choice had been made. He was to look in every direction, not to select a preferred portion, but to receive a renewed declaration concerning the whole land. "All the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever." Lot's choice had not reduced what God promised Abram. The valley selected by Lot lay within the view of a promise larger than either man's immediate settlement. Abram had allowed his nephew to choose, and God answered by restating that the land in every direction belonged to the future assigned to Abram and his descendants. Then the promise turned again to offspring. God would make Abram's descendants like the dust of the earth. If a person could count the dust, then Abram's offspring could also be counted. The image did not merely promise that Abram would have one heir. It expanded the future into a multitude beyond ordinary numbering. Sarai's barrenness still defined their household, but the promise described descendants spread beyond calculation. The separation from Lot made that promise more pointed. Abram had not gained a son through his nephew's continued presence. Lot now had his own household and his own chosen territory. The nation promised to Abram would not be formed by simply treating Lot as the answer. God continued to speak of Abram's own offspring. Abram was then commanded to move through the land. "Arise, walk through its length and its breadth, for I will give it to you." He could traverse what he did not yet own. His movement through Canaan became a physical encounter with the extent of the promise. The gift was declared, but Abram's present life remained that of a man pitching and moving his tent. Abram moved his tent and came to live by the oaks of Mamre, which were at Hebron. There he built another altar to the Lord. The conflict with Lot had ended. Their herdsmen were no longer struggling to sustain both groups in one place. Lot had the well-watered valley he selected. Abram had the renewed word of God and a place beside the oaks of Mamre. The contrast between the two men was now visible in their locations. Lot had moved his tents near Sodom. Abram remained in Canaan and built an altar at Hebron. One had chosen the region that appeared most productive. The other had received no immediate tract by human agreement, yet the whole land had again been promised to his offspring. Abram's wealth had survived Egypt and increased. His marriage had survived the danger created by his deception. His relationship with Lot had survived through separation rather than continued strife. At each point, something had been preserved, but each preservation changed the shape of his household. He had returned with more livestock than the land around both men could support. That abundance drove Lot away from him. Lot's departure then exposed the unanswered center of the promise. Abram possessed great wealth, but the future described by God still depended on offspring. At Mamre, Abram could live, build an altar, and move through the land. He could look north, south, east, and west. He could hear that the territory would belong to his descendants forever. But he remained a sojourner, and the land remained occupied by others. Beyond him, Lot's tents now reached towards Sodom. The separation had brought peace between the two households, but it had also placed the son of Abram's dead brother beside a city known for wickedness. Abram's nearest relative in the land was moving along a path Abram could no longer control, so the promise stood between two unresolved dangers. Within Abram's own tent, the descendants, compared to the dust of the earth, had yet to begin. Across the valley, Lot had chosen a place whose abundance concealed how dangerous his new neighbors would become. That danger did not begin inside Sodom. It came from a conflict among kings that reached across the region and eventually swept Lot into its path. 4 eastern rulers formed one side. They were Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim. 5 kings of the Jordan Valley stood on the other side: Bera, king of Sodom, Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeba, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which was also called Zoar. The 5 had been subject to Chedorlaomer for 12 years. In the 13th year, they rebelled. Their refusal brought a military response, but the 4 eastern kings did not advance directly to Sodom. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and his allies began a campaign through the surrounding territories. They defeated the Rephaim at Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim at Ham, and the Emim at Shaveh-Kiriathaim. They struck the Horites in the hill country of Seir and drove as far as El Paran at the edge of the wilderness. Then they turned back toward En-Mishpat, which was also called Kadesh. They conquered the country of the Amalekites and defeated the Amorites living at Hazazon Tamar. By the time this advancing force approached the cities of the valley, it had already overcome one people after another. The rebellion against Chedorlaomer had become part of a larger campaign in which the 4 kings repeatedly demonstrated their strength. The kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela came out to meet them. They assembled their forces in the valley of Siddim, the region identified with the Salt Sea. There, the 5 kings joined battle against the 4. On one side stood Chedorlaomer, Tidal, Amraphel, and Arioch. On the other stood the rulers of the 5 cities. The numerical difference did not decide the outcome. The 4 kings defeated the 5. The valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits. As the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, they fell there. The remaining forces escaped toward the hills. The defeat left the cities exposed. The victorious army took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah, along with their food, and departed. Their campaign had begun as an answer to rebellion. It now ended with the wealth and provisions of the defeated cities carried away. Lot was caught in that removal. Because he was living in Sodom, the invaders took him with his possessions and continued on their way. The choice Lot had made when he looked over the well-watered valley had now placed him within the fate of the city beside which he settled. His flocks and tents had once made separation from Abram necessary. Now, an army powerful enough to defeat Sodom and its allies carried him and his property away. One man escaped from the battle and came to Abram the Hebrew. Abram was still living by the oaks belonging to Mamre the Amorite. Mamre's brothers were Eshcol and Anah, and all 3 were allied with Abram. The fugitive brought direct news. Abram's kinsman had been captured. The separation between Abram and Lot had ended their conflict over land, but it had not ended their bond. Abram had allowed Lot to choose where he would live. He had watched him move toward Sodom. Now the consequences of that choice arrived at Abram's tent, in the words of a survivor. Abram acted at once. He gathered the trained men born in his household. There were 318 of them. These were not troops supplied by one of the cities that had lost the battle. They belonged to the household Abram had built through his years of movement and increasing wealth. He led them in pursuit as far as Dan. The difference in scale was severe. The force Abram pursued had defeated a five-king alliance after conquering several other peoples along its route. It was moving away with captives, goods, and food taken from Sodom and Gomorrah. Abram followed with the trained men of his own house and with the support of his allies. At night, Abram divided his forces against the eastern army. He and his servants attacked. The army that had overcome the region was defeated by the sojourner whose nephew it had taken. Abram continued the pursuit as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. He did not stop after forcing the enemy away from the immediate battlefield. He followed until the captives and property were recovered. He brought back everything. Lot was recovered with his possessions. The women and the other people taken from the cities were brought back as well. The rescue reversed the outcome of the battle in the valley of Siddim. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah had fled, their cities had been stripped, and their people had been carried off. Abram entered the conflict only after the defeat, pursued the victorious army, struck it by night, and returned with what it had taken. This was the same man who had once feared that the Egyptians would kill him because of Sarai. In Egypt, his strategy had depended on concealing his marriage and accepting wealth from Pharaoh. Here, when Lot was taken by a force that had crushed kings, Abram did not conceal his relationship to the captive. He armed his household and went after him. His wealth now served a different purpose. The large household that had contributed to conflict over grazing land also contained trained men capable of pursuit and battle. The possessions that once helped drive Lot and Abram apart had become part of the strength used to bring Lot home. Yet Abram did not turn the victory into a claim over Lot's life or property. He recovered what belonged to the captives and brought it back. As Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him. Their meeting took place in the valley of Shaveh, also called the King's Valley, but another king appeared there as well. Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He brought out bread and wine. His presence introduced a different kind of recognition. The king of Sodom approached as the ruler of a defeated city whose people and goods Abram had recovered. Melchizedek approached as both king and priest, and he spoke first in blessing. "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." The blessing identified the true source of the victory. Abram had gathered the men. Abram had pursued the army. Abram had divided his forces, attacked by night, and followed the enemy north of Damascus. But Melchizedek declared that God Most High had delivered Abram's enemies into his hand. The title carried the victory beyond the claims of any local ruler. The God who blessed Abram was possessor of heaven and earth. Chedorlaomer could demand service from other kings. The cities of the valley could rebel against him. Armies could seize people and goods. But the outcome of Abram's pursuit belonged to the authority of God Most High. Abram accepted the blessing. Then he gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything. The exchange placed Abram's victory within the blessing pronounced over him. Melchizedek supplied bread and wine, blessed Abram in the name of God Most High, and blessed God for delivering the enemy. Abram answered by giving him a tenth. The king of Sodom then made his own proposal. "Give me the persons," he said, "but take the goods for yourself." The offer distinguished between the recovered people and the recovered property. The king wanted his subjects returned. Abram could keep the goods taken from the city. On its face, the proposal would have made Abram richer. He had risked his household in pursuit, defeated the invaders, and brought back the spoils. The king of Sodom now offered him the material wealth as a reward, while asking only for the people. Abram refused. He answered with an oath addressed to the same God, named by Melchizedek. I have lifted my hand to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. Abram would not accept even the smallest item belonging to Sodom. A thread and a sandal strap defined the refusal at its narrowest point. He would not take the greater wealth, and he would not take the least object. His reason was explicit. The king of Sodom would not be able to say that he had made Abram rich. The refusal separated Abram from the wealth of the city Lot had chosen. Abram had already become prosperous through possessions acquired in Haran and through what Pharaoh gave him in Egypt. That experience had shown how wealth received during a compromised arrangement could attach his prosperity to another ruler's actions. After the victory over Chedorlaomer, Abram would not allow Sodom's king to claim that role. Melchizedek had declared Abram blessed by God Most High. Abram's oath now matched that declaration. His enrichment would not be attributed to the ruler of Sodom, and the rescue of Lot would not become a transaction through which Abram absorbed the city's goods. His refusal did not erase the rights of the men who had accompanied him. Abram allowed what his young men had eaten during the campaign. He also protected the portion belonging to Anna, Eshcol, and Mamre. They had gone with him, and they were entitled to their share. The distinction was exact. Abram would take nothing for himself from Sodom's property, but he would not use his oath to deprive his allies. His decision governed his own portion. It did not turn their service into an unpaid extension of his refusal. The king of Sodom had asked for the people. Abram had already brought the people back. Lot and his possessions were among them. The immediate crisis that began with the rebellion against Chedorlaomer had ended with the captives restored and the offered wealth rejected. Abram emerged from the campaign with a new public stature. He had not entered as one of the kings whose cities were at stake. He possessed no city and commanded no regional army. He lived beside the oaks of Mamre as an allied sojourner. Yet when the 5 kings failed, Abram's household accomplished what their combined forces had not. He pursued the victors, recovered the captives, and returned with the goods. 2 kings then met him, and each encounter defined the victory differently. Melchizedek pronounced blessing and named God as the one who delivered Abram's enemies into his hand. Abram answered with a tenth. The king of Sodom offered material reward and asked for his people. Abram returned what had been recovered and rejected the reward so completely that Sodom could claim no part in making him rich. Lot was free again because Abram had intervened. His property was restored. The relationship between the 2 men had survived distance, strife among their herdsmen, and Lot's decision to settle near Sodom. When an invading army carried Lot away, Abram still called him kin through his actions and accepted the danger of bringing him back. But the rescue did not undo Lot's choice of residence. Abram's victory answered one disaster without resolving the condition that had placed Lot inside Sodom's defeat. Lot had been recovered from an army, not separated from the city, whose king now stood before Abram. For Abram, the victory also left the deepest promise untouched. He had enough trained men in his household to challenge kings. He had allies among the Amorites. He had livestock, silver, and gold. He had received the blessing of Melchizedek and returned from battle without depending on Sodom's reward. He could rescue another man's household. He could recover another man's possessions. He could refuse wealth because he was already rich. But none of those achievements produced the offspring to whom Canaan had been promised. Abram returned from the battle as the man who had defeated kings, rescued Lot, and been blessed in the king's valley. Yet inside his own household, the future still had no visible heir. Military courage could recover what an enemy had taken. It could not create what Abram and Sarai had never possessed. Then the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward will be very great." The words addressed both fear and reward. Abram had just returned from a battle against kings, and he had refused the goods offered by Sodom. Now God identified himself as Abram's protection and spoke of a reward beyond what that king could give. Abram answered by naming the one thing still missing. "O Lord God, what will you give me, since I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" The question did not deny Abram's wealth. It exposed the limit of wealth. Everything he possessed would eventually pass to someone, and the person positioned to receive it was a servant born outside Abram's family line. Abram pressed the problem further. "You have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir." God had promised to make Abram a great nation. He had promised the land to Abram's offspring and compared those offspring to the dust of the earth. But Abram's present household presented a different succession. With no child of his own, a household servant stood as heir. The Lord answered directly, "This man shall not be your heir. Your own son shall be your heir." The promise now excluded the solution Abram had identified. Eliezer would not carry the inheritance simply because he occupied that position within the household. The heir would come from Abram himself. Then God brought Abram outside. "Look toward heaven," he said, "and count the stars if you are able to count them." Abram had once been told to look across the land in every direction. That promise concerned the territory his offspring would receive. Now he was told to look upward, beyond any number he could complete. "So shall your offspring be." The comparison transformed the question of a single heir into the promise of an innumerable line. Abram had asked who would inherit his house. God answered not only with a son from Abram's own body, but with descendants beyond counting. Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord counted it to him as righteousness. The moment turned on trust in what God had said. Abram still stood without the promised son in his household. The stars did not explain how the child would be born or when the birth would come. They supplied the measure God chose for the future, not one substitute heir, but a multitude descending from Abram. God then spoke again about the land. "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess." Abram's departure was now defined by the purpose behind it. Terah had first taken the family out of Ur toward Canaan. Abram had later left Haran under God's command and entered the land he was shown. Now the Lord joined the beginning and destination in one declaration. He had brought Abram out of Ur to give him this land. Abram asked, "O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it?" His earlier question had concerned the heir. God answered by promising a son from Abram himself. This second question concerned possession. Abram had walked through Canaan, lived beside its oaks, and built altars there. But the land was still occupied by the peoples already dwelling in it. God responded with instructions. "Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." Abram brought all of them. He cut the larger animals in two and arranged each half opposite the other. He did not cut the birds. The pieces formed a passage between them. Abram had asked how he would know that he would possess the land, and the answer now took physical form before him. Selected animals, divided bodies, and an open space running through the middle. Birds of prey descended upon the carcasses. Abram drove them away. The promise of land had begun with sweeping images. Every direction Abram could see, every place he could walk, descendants as numerous as dust. Here the setting narrowed to Abram guarding the prepared pieces from scavenging birds while he waited for what God would do. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. Then a dreadful and great darkness came over him. The answer to his question would not be a promise of immediate possession. Before the boundaries of the land were named, Abram was told about the long delay his descendants would endure. Know for certain that your offspring will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. The descendants, compared to the stars, would first live outside their own land. They would serve another people and be afflicted for 400 years. This future placed suffering between the promise and its fulfillment. Abram would have offspring, but their existence would not move in a straight line from birth to possession. They would become strangers, as Abram was a stranger. Unlike Abram, they would be subjected to service and affliction. God also declared the limit of that oppression. I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve. The nation holding Abram's descendants would not determine their permanent fate. God would judge it, and Abram's offspring would come out with great possessions. Their departure would reverse their position. They would enter that land as strangers and servants. They would leave it after judgment, carrying wealth with them. But Abram would not live through those events. You shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. The promise of Canaan extended beyond Abram's lifetime. He would receive a peaceful end, but the great return of his descendants would belong to another generation. The land could be guaranteed to him, even though its full possession would not occur while he lived. Then God marked the point of return. In the 4th generation they shall come back here. The return would wait, because the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet complete. That explanation placed the delay within more than the growth of Abram's family. The people then living in the land had a measured history before judgment. Abram's descendants would not take possession immediately, and their future suffering would not authorize an early seizure. Their return and the judgment of the Amorites would meet at the time God had set. The answer to Abram's question was therefore larger than a personal sign of reassurance. To know that he would possess the land, Abram had to understand that the gift would unfold across generations. His offspring would exist. They would leave this land. They would become strangers elsewhere. They would be oppressed, delivered, and brought back. Abram's own death would come before that return. The land promise was certain, but it was not simple. The sun went down and darkness covered the scene. Then a smoking firepot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided pieces. Abram did not walk between them. The visible signs of fire and smoke moved through the passage, while he remained under the darkness that had fallen upon him. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. To your offspring I give this land. The boundaries were then declared from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. This was far more than the immediate region around Abram's tent. The promise extended across lands occupied by named peoples: the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Abram had asked how he could know that he would possess the land. God answered by binding himself in covenant and by defining both the land and the path through which Abram's descendants would reach it. The covenant did not erase the waiting. It made the waiting part of a declared future. Abram's offspring would be as numerous as the stars, yet they would spend 400 years as strangers under affliction. They would inherit the land, yet they would first leave it. The nations within its boundaries would give way, yet their judgment would wait until the iniquity of the Amorites was complete. Abram's own place within that future was equally precise. He would become the father of the promised descendants, but he would not lead them out of their oppression. He would receive God's commitment to the land, but he would die before the 4th generation returned to possess it. His life was now held between two certainties. A son would come from him, and Abram himself would go to his fathers in peace. That made the promised heir essential. If the fulfillment extended beyond Abram's death, then the covenant required a living line capable of passing through generations. Eliezer of Damascus could manage the present household, but he could not replace the son God had promised from Abram's own body. The stars had answered the scale of the descendants. The covenant had answered the certainty of the land. The prophecy had answered why possession would be delayed. One question remained open inside Abram's home. God had identified the father of the heir, but he had not yet named the mother. Abram knew that the son would come from his own body. Sarai remained with him, and the years continued to advance without the promised birth. The covenant guaranteed an outcome across centuries. Abram and Sarai still had to live through the next day, and the next day became years. Sarai still bore Abram no children. After Abram had lived in Canaan for 10 years, the question of an heir remained inside their household, and Sarai acted. She had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. Sarai spoke to Abram and identified her barrenness as something the Lord had permitted. "The Lord has prevented me from bearing children," she said. "Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children through her." Her proposal separated the roles of wife, mother, and servant. Hagar would conceive by Abram, but Sarai intended to build a family through the child. The arrangement would use Hagar's ability to bear children as the answer to Sarai's inability. Abram listened to Sarai. Sarai then took Hagar and gave her to Abram as a wife. She did this after the 10 years in Canaan, while they were living in the very land promised to Abram's offspring. The delay had now produced a plan within the household. God had promised that Abram's own son would be his heir. Sarai's proposal met that condition at one level. A child conceived by Hagar would come from Abram's body, but the promise had not directed them to Hagar. And Sarai's plan placed the future of the household inside a relationship that immediately changed the position of everyone involved. Abram went into Hagar, and she conceived. The plan succeeded in producing the pregnancy Sarai wanted, but conception did not bring the result Sarai expected. When Hagar saw that she had conceived, she looked upon her mistress with contempt. Pregnancy altered the balance between them. Sarai remained Abram's wife and Hagar's mistress, but Hagar now carried Abram's child. The servant possessed within her body the ability Sarai had sought to use, and Sarai became contemptible in Hagar's eyes. Sarai brought the conflict to Abram. "May the wrong done to me be on you," she said. She reminded him of her own part in the arrangement. "I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt." Sarai had initiated the plan, selected Hagar, and given her to Abram. Yet she held Abram responsible for the injury that followed. What began as an attempt to build Sarai's household had become a humiliation within it. Then Sarai placed the dispute before the Lord. "May the Lord judge between you and me." Abram did not settle the conflict by defining a new position for Hagar or by protecting her because she carried his child. He returned authority over Hagar to Sarai. "Your servant is in your power," he said. "Do to her as you please." His answer emphasized the relationship that pregnancy had unsettled. Although Hagar had been given to Abram as a wife, Abram now spoke of her as Sarai's servant and placed her back under Sarai's hand. Sarai dealt harshly with Hagar. Hagar fled from her. The arrangement had moved through a chain of consequences. Sarai's barrenness led her to give Hagar to Abram. Hagar conceived and regarded Sarai with contempt. Sarai accused Abram of allowing the wrong. Abram handed Hagar back to Sarai's authority. Sarai's harsh treatment then drove the pregnant servant out of the household. Hagar's flight carried Abram's unborn son away with her. She entered the wilderness and came to a spring of water on the way to Shur. There the angel of the Lord found her. The encounter began with a question that named both Hagar and the relationship from which she had run. "Hagar, servant of Sarai, Where have you come from, and where are you going?" Hagar answered the first part. "I am fleeing from my mistress, Sarai." She identified Sarai as her mistress, even after leaving her authority behind. She also stated what she was doing. This was not a journey commissioned by Abram or an agreed separation between the women. Hagar was in flight. The angel of the Lord told her to return. "Return to your mistress and submit to her." The instruction did not erase what had driven Hagar away. It sent her back into the relationship she had left and required her to place herself under Sarai's authority again. But the command to return came with a promise directed personally to Hagar. The angel of the Lord said, "I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude." The language matched the scale of the promise Abram had received. Abram's descendants had been compared to the dust of the earth and the stars in the heavens, beyond counting. Now Hagar was told that her own offspring would become too numerous to count. She was not being sent back merely as a servant carrying a child for someone else's household. She was the mother of a promised multitude. The angel then spoke about the child she was carrying. "You are pregnant and shall bear a son." Hagar learned the sex of the child before his birth. She also received his name. "You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction." The name joined the son's identity to what had happened to his mother. Ishmael meant that God hears. Hagar had fled because Sarai dealt harshly with her, and the Lord had listened to her affliction. Abram had heard Sarai's proposal. Sarai had asked the Lord to judge between herself and Abram. Now, away from their tents, Hagar heard that the Lord had listened to her. Her suffering was not hidden by her status in the household. She was Sarai's servant, a woman given to Abram for the purpose of bearing a child, and a fugitive found in the wilderness. The promise came to her by name. The angel also described the kind of man Ishmael would become. "He shall be a wild donkey of a man. His hand would be against everyone, and everyone's hand would be against him. He would dwell in opposition to all his kinsmen." The son born out of conflict would have a future marked by conflict. He would not disappear into Abram's household as an unnamed solution to Sarai's barrenness. Ishmael would have his own identity, his own descendants, and his own contested place among his relatives. That future did not answer whether he was the heir God had promised Abram. It established that the child mattered, that he would live, and that his line would multiply. Hagar responded to the Lord who had spoken to her. She gave him a name. "You are a God of seeing." Her words centered on the astonishing recognition that followed the encounter. "Have I really seen the one who sees me?" Hagar had been treated within Abram and Sarai's plan as the servant through whom Sarai would obtain children. At the spring, she was addressed as an individual. The angel called her by name, asked where she had come from, listened to her answer, commanded her return, promised her descendants, and named her son. She had fled from the sight of her mistress, but she had been found by the God who saw her. The well connected with that encounter was called Beer-lahai-roi, the well of the living one who sees me. It lay between Kadesh and Bered. The name gave a fixed location to Hagar's recognition. Abram had built altars where the Lord appeared and spoke to him. Hagar named the God who saw her and left the name of that encounter attached to a well in the wilderness. She returned, and the pregnancy continued to birth. Hagar bore Abram a son. Abram named the son Ishmael. The name given to Hagar at the spring was the name Abram gave the child. The boy entered the household, carrying within his name the declaration that the Lord had listened to his mother's affliction. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. For the first time, Abram had a son from his own body. The household servant Eliezer no longer stood as the only visible answer to the question of inheritance. A child had been born, and that child had received a divine promise of innumerable descendants before his birth. Sarai's proposal had accomplished what she set out to produce. Hagar had borne Abram's child. but every relationship involved had been altered by the process. Hagar was still Sarai's servant, yet she had also become Abram's wife and the mother of his son. Sarai remained mistress of the household, but conception had exposed her to contempt and provoked a conflict severe enough to send Hagar into flight. Abram had accepted Sarai's plan, fathered the child, and returned Hagar to Sarai's power when the women came into conflict. The Lord's intervention did not begin by resolving the conflict inside the tents. It met Hagar outside them. The pregnant servant was found, commanded to return, and given promises that belonged to her and her son. Ishmael therefore entered Abram's household with two futures spoken over him. Through Abram, he belonged to the man promised offspring beyond counting. Through Hagar, he had been personally promised descendants too numerous to count. His birth proved that Abram could father a child, and his name testified that the Lord had heard Hagar. But the covenant promise had included more than biological descent. It concerned the particular heir through whom Abram's household and the promised land would move into the future. God had ruled out Eliezer and promised a son from Abram's own body. Ishmael met that description. At the moment of his birth, the remaining distinction had not yet been given. Abram could now look at a living son rather than a household servant positioned to inherit. The years of childlessness had ended for him. For Sarai, they had not. The child had been conceived through her plan, but he had been born to Hagar. Sarai had said that she would be built up through her servant. What followed was not a peaceful transfer of motherhood. It was contempt, accusation, harsh treatment, flight, return, and the birth of a son whose own mother had received a promise from God. The attempt to bring the promise closer had made its path more complicated. Ishmael was real. His future was protected. His descendants would become a multitude. He could not be treated as though his birth had no consequence simply because the household arrangement had produced pain. At the same time, the original questions had not all been settled. The land had been promised to Abram's offspring. A son from Abram's own body had been promised as heir. Now Abram had such a son, and the household would live according to that visible fact. Abram was 86. Ishmael was the child in his tents. Sarai was still barren, and before the next word clarified the covenant, 13 years would pass. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him again. "I am God Almighty," he said. "Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and multiply you greatly." Abram fell face down. The 13 years since Ishmael's birth had brought Abram to this moment with one son in his household. Now God returned to the covenant and began by speaking not about what Abram could arrange, but about who God was and how Abram was to live before him. God continued speaking while Abram remained face down. "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations." The promise expanded beyond a single national line. Abram would father a multitude of nations, and his own name would now carry that future. "No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations." Abram became Abraham. The change marked him according to the future God had declared. The man who had once identified himself as childless would now bear a name joined to multitudes. His household contained one son, but God spoke of nations. "I will make you exceedingly fruitful," God said. "I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you." The promised descendants would not remain one undifferentiated family. Nations and kings would arise from Abraham. The covenant reached through generations, not yet born, and gave his renamed life a purpose far beyond the limits of his present tense. God then defined the duration of the covenant. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant. The relationship would extend from Abraham to his descendants. God would be God to Abraham and to his offspring after him. The land promise was included within that enduring relationship. I will give to you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Canaan was called the land of Abraham's sojournings, because that was still how he lived there. He had traveled its length and breadth, pitched tents in several places, and received repeated promises concerning it. Now the whole land where he lived as a foreigner was named as the everlasting possession of his descendants. The covenant joined three things: God's relationship with Abraham, God's relationship with Abraham's future offspring, and the gift of the land in which Abraham currently sojourned. Then God gave Abraham a command that would place the covenant upon the bodies of the males in his household. As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring, after you throughout their generations. Every male among them was to be circumcised. The flesh of the foreskin was to be removed, and that mark would serve as a sign of the covenant between God and Abraham. The command did not apply only to Abraham or to the son he expected to inherit. Every male in the covenant household was included. At 8 days old, each male child was to be circumcised throughout their generations. The requirement covered those born within the house and those purchased with money from a foreigner who was not Abraham's offspring. A male's place within the household determined his inclusion in the sign. Birth from Abraham's line did not define the entire group. Servants purchased from outside the family were also to bear the mark. He who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised, God said. The covenant would be carried in their flesh as an everlasting covenant. The command also carried a penalty. Any uncircumcised male who was not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin would be cut off from his people. He had broken the covenant. The sign therefore created an obligation that Abraham could not treat as symbolic language alone. It required an action upon himself, Ishmael, and every male under his authority. Future sons would receive the sign on the 8th day. Adult males already living in the household would receive it now. The promise of descendants had become a command governing the descendants and the household before the central promised son had even been identified. Then God turned to Sarai. As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. Like Abraham, she received a new name. And for the first time, God identified her directly as the mother through whom the promised son would come. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. Hagar had borne Abraham a son. Ishmael was 13 years old and lived within the household, but the covenant promise had not reached its full definition with Ishmael's birth. God now named Sarah, Abraham's wife, as the woman who would bear the son still to come. The blessing over Sarah matched the scale of the blessing over Abraham. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Sarah's place was not secondary to the future of the covenant family. Nations and kings would come from her. The woman whose barrenness had driven the arrangement with Hagar was now personally named within the promise of fruitfulness. Abraham fell face down again. He laughed. Within himself he said, "Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" The objection was expressed through their ages. Abraham stood at 99, and the promised birth would come when he was 100. Sarah was 90. The long years of barrenness had continued into old age, and now God's promise specified that she herself would give birth. Abraham answered with the son already living before him. "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." The request placed Ishmael at the center of Abraham's response. Ishmael was not an imagined heir or a hoped-for pregnancy. He was Abraham's 13-year-old son, the result of Sarai's proposal and Hagar's conception. God had already promised Hagar that Ishmael's descendants would be too numerous to count. Abraham asked that this living son stand before God. God answered with a clear distinction, "No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac." The answer did not reject Ishmael's life. It rejected Ishmael as a replacement for the son Sarah would bear. Abraham's proposal could not redirect the covenant away from the birth God had now defined. Sarah would bear a son to Abraham. His name would be Isaac. Abraham had laughed when he heard that a child would be born to a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman. The son's given name would carry that moment forward. Before Isaac was conceived, he was named in the middle of Abraham's laughter. God then identified Isaac's place. "I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him." This was the distinction Abraham had not known when Ishmael was born. Both sons would descend from Abraham. Both would receive divine promises. But the everlasting covenant would be established with Isaac and with Isaac's descendants. God also answered Abraham's plea concerning Ishmael. "As for Ishmael, I have heard you." The declaration echoed the name Ishmael already bore. God hears. The Lord had listened to Hagar's affliction before Ishmael's birth. Now he listened to Abraham's appeal for his son. "Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly." Ishmael would father 12 princes, and God would make him into a great nation. His future was not erased by the choice of Isaac. The multiplication promised to Hagar was confirmed to Abraham. Ishmael would be fruitful, his descendants would become numerous, 12 rulers would come from him, and his line would form a great nation. But God repeated the distinction. "I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year." The timing was now fixed. Sarah's son would not remain an open promise extending through an undefined future. He would be born at the appointed time in the following year. Abraham knew the mother, the child's sex, the child's name, the child's covenant role, and the time of his birth. Sarah would bear him. The son would be called Isaac. The everlasting covenant would pass through him. And within a year, the child would arrive. When God finished speaking, he went up from Abraham. The divine appearance ended, but the command given during it required immediate action. Abraham did not wait for Isaac's birth before marking the household with the covenant sign. That very day, Abraham took Ishmael and every male born in his house. He also gathered every male purchased with his money. He circumcised them in the flesh of their foreskins, just as God had commanded him. The size and variety of Abraham's household made the obedience extensive. The sign was placed on the son born to Hagar, the servants born within the household, and the servants acquired from foreigners. Every male under Abraham's authority was included. Abraham himself was 99 years old when he was circumcised. Ishmael was 13. Father and son received the sign on the same day. All the men of Abraham's house, whether born there or purchased from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. The covenant was now visible in the household before Isaac entered it. Ishmael bore its sign, even though the everlasting covenant line would pass through his younger brother. Servants bore it, even though they were not Abraham's offspring. Abraham bore it as the man through whom nations and kings had been promised. The act established a boundary of belonging that reached beyond natural descent while remaining connected to the future of Abraham's descendants. The sign marked those living under the covenant command, while God's words still distinguished the particular son through whom the everlasting covenant would continue. Abraham's response also stood in contrast to the arrangement that produced Ishmael. When Sarai proposed Hagar, Abram listened to his wife and acted on a household plan intended to obtain children. The result brought conception, contempt, harsh treatment and flight before God intervened for Hagar. Here, Abraham received a direct command from God and carried it out that same day. He did not alter the terms. He did not limit the sign to himself and Ishmael. He circumcised every male identified by the command. The household entered a new stage. Abram and Sarai now bore the names Abraham and Sarah. The change declared a future of nations before Sarah had borne even one child. Their bodies had reached ages that made Abraham laugh at the promise, yet God set the birth within the coming year. Ishmael's position was also clearer. He remained Abraham's son. He had been blessed. His descendants would multiply greatly. He would father 12 princes and become a great nation. He also bore the covenant sign in his flesh from the age of 13, but he would not replace Isaac. The covenant line would be established with the son born to Sarah. That son would receive the promise for his offspring after him, while Ishmael would receive a distinct future of fruitfulness and nationhood. Abraham no longer had to ask whether Eliezer would inherit his household. He no longer had to treat Ishmael's presence as the only visible way for the promise to continue. God had now excluded both alternatives from the central covenant succession. The heir would not be a servant from Damascus. He would not be the son born through Hagar. He would be Isaac, the son of Abraham and Sarah. Every part of that declaration intensified the apparent impossibility rather than reducing it. God did not choose a younger woman in Abraham's household. He named Sarah at 90. He did not extend the promise indefinitely. He set the appointed time for the following year. Abraham had heard the announcement. He had laughed, questioned it, appealed for Ishmael, received the answer and obeyed the command of circumcision. Sarah had not yet stood within such an encounter. The promise concerned her body, her blessing, and the nations and kings that would come from her. But Abraham was the one who heard these words. The household was marked and waiting. Abraham was 99, Sarah was 90, Ishmael was 13. Isaac had a name, a covenant, and an appointed year before he had been conceived. And the next announcement would come close enough for Sarah herself to hear it. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre. Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent during the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. The encounter began without an announcement of who they were. Abraham saw visitors, and his first response was immediate hospitality. He ran from the tent entrance to meet them. Then he bowed low to the ground. "O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant." He asked them to remain while water was brought, so they could wash their feet. They could rest beneath the tree, and Abraham would bring bread so they could refresh themselves before continuing their journey. "For this is why you have come to your servant," he said. The visitors accepted. "Do as you have said." Abraham hurried into the tent and spoke to Sarah. "Quick, 3 measures of fine flour, knead it and make cakes." Sarah had received a new name and a promise concerning a son, but the immediate demand inside the tent was practical. Abraham had welcomed 3 visitors, and Sarah began preparing bread for them. Abraham ran to the herd. He selected a tender and good calf and gave it to a young man, who hurried to prepare it. Then Abraham took curds and milk along with the calf that had been prepared. He placed the food before the visitors beneath the tree. While they ate, Abraham stood beside them. The welcome had expanded beyond the morsel of bread Abraham first offered. Water for their feet, rest beneath the tree, cakes made from fine flour, curds, milk, and a prepared calf were all brought together quickly. Abraham, Sarah, and the young man each took part in serving the visitors. Then the conversation changed. The visitors asked Abraham, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" The question identified her by the new name God had given her. Sarah was inside the tent, separated from the meal, but close enough to hear. "There, in the tent," Abraham answered. Then one of the visitors said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." The announcement repeated what Abraham had already been told. The appointed time remained the same. Within the following year, Sarah would bear the promised child. But now, Sarah heard it. She was listening at the entrance of the tent behind the speaker. The promise was no longer something Abraham alone had received and carried back into the household. It was spoken where Sarah herself could hear both the timing and the declaration that she would have a son. The circumstances had not changed since God spoke to Abraham. Abraham and Sarah were old and advanced in years. Sarah had passed the ordinary way of women. Her body no longer followed the process by which conception and birth came. The promise did not arrive before that condition. It arrived after it had become firmly established. Sarah laughed within herself. "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" Her laughter remained internal, but the Lord addressed it. He spoke to Abraham. "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?'" The question revealed that Sarah's private response had been heard. She had been behind the speaker at the tent entrance. Her laughter had not interrupted the conversation or challenged the visitor aloud, yet the Lord named both the laughter and the reason within it. Then came the question at the center of the visit. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Sarah's age was real. Abraham's age was real. The end of Sarah's childbearing years was real. The promise did not ask Abraham and Sarah to deny those facts. It placed those facts beneath the ability of the one who had made the promise. The time was stated again. At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. The birth was not left as an undefined possibility. The visitor repeated both the mother and the schedule. Sarah, not Hagar, not another woman in the household, would bear the child. The birth would occur at the appointed time in the coming year. Sarah denied laughing. "I did not laugh," she said. She was afraid. The denial was itself answered immediately. "No, but you did laugh." The exchange left no room for Sarah to hide her response behind the tent entrance. The Lord, who had named her as the mother of nations, also knew how she received the announcement. Her disbelief was exposed without withdrawing the promise. The son would still come. That was the decisive difference between the laughter and the word that answered it. Sarah's reaction did not change the appointed time. It did not transfer the promise to Hagar or return Ishmael to the central covenant position. It did not cause God to select another mother. Sarah laughed, denied laughing, and was corrected. She would still bear Isaac. Abraham had laughed when God first identified Sarah as the mother. He had asked whether a child could be born to a 100-year-old man and whether Sarah could bear at 90. Then he had appealed for Ishmael. God had answered by naming Isaac. Now Sarah's response followed the same pattern of recognition. The announcement reached the precise point that made the promise difficult to receive, her own age and Abraham's. Her laughter came from within, yet it was met by a direct question about the power of the Lord. Husband and wife had now heard the promise separately. Abraham heard it while face down before God. Sarah heard it while standing within the tent behind the visitor, as a meal was being served outside. Abraham's response had turned toward the living son already in his household. Sarah's response turned toward the condition of her own aged body and the age of her husband. Both responses confronted the same declaration. Sarah would bear a son. His name would be Isaac. His birth would occur within the appointed year, and the covenant would continue through him. The setting made the announcement strikingly close to the life it would change. God did not speak of Sarah only as a distant figure within a future generation. The visitors came to the place where Abraham and Sarah lived. They ate food prepared by their household. They asked where Sarah was. Then the promise was spoken within her hearing. The woman whose servant had borne Abraham's first son now heard that her own pregnancy would define the covenant line. The distinction between the two sons had already been given to Abraham, But Sarah's experience of the promise was different. She had lived through the years when she bore Abram no children. She had proposed Hagar as the means by which she could obtain a family. She had then endured the contempt and conflict that followed Hagar's conception. Now the solution did not involve another woman. The Lord's answer centered on Sarah herself. The birth would not come through the authority she held over a servant. It would come through the power of the Lord working where Sarah saw only age and physical exhaustion. That was why the question, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" did more than confront laughter. It clarified the source of the child's birth. When Sarai gave Hagar to Abram, their plan depended on Hagar's ability to conceive. When God promised Isaac, fulfillment depended on God's ability to do what Sarah's condition could not produce. The household's earlier arrangement had brought forth Ishmael, a real son with a real promise and a future nation. The coming birth would not undo his existence. It would establish the line God had specifically chosen. Sarah's laughter also gave the promised name a deeper place within the household. Abraham had laughed before Isaac was named. Sarah laughed when she heard that the birth would occur within the year. The child called Isaac would enter a family in which both parents had responded to his promised birth with laughter. But their laughter did not mean exactly the same thing as the joy the child would bring. At this moment, it exposed the distance between what they heard and what their ages allowed them to expect. That distance was now measured in time. The visitor would return at the appointed season. Sarah would have a son. The promise could be tested against the coming year. Abraham and Sarah were not told to begin another arrangement. They were not given a household task designed to bring about conception. The command of circumcision had already been carried out. Here they received an announcement. The Lord would act, the child would be Sarah's, and the date belonged to the following year. The visit beneath the oaks therefore accomplished what the earlier appearance to Abraham had not. It brought Sarah into direct contact with the promise, not through Abraham's report, but through words she personally heard. It also exposed what remained unresolved within her. A new name had not removed the force of age. A promise of nations had not made the physical condition easier to understand. The appointed time had not prevented laughter. The Lord answered the laughter without extending the schedule or softening the claim. The same promise was simply stated again. Sarah would have a son. The power of the promise rested with the Lord who heard her laughter, even when she laughed within herself. For Abraham, the visit also confirmed that the son named during the covenant appearance was not a distant descendant attached to an indefinite future. Isaac would be born into his present household. The servants circumcised with him would see the arrival. 13-year-old Ishmael would have a younger brother. Sarah would become the mother of the child through whom the everlasting covenant would continue. The promise had moved from generations, nations, and kings to a period as short as the coming year. That made the waiting more precise. Abraham had waited from the age of 75, when he left Haran, until the age of 86 when Ishmael was born. He had then lived 13 more years before God named Sarah as Isaac's mother. Now, at 99, he was told that the birth would occur when he was 100. The long uncertainty had narrowed to an appointed return. Sarah's question within herself had concerned the possibility of pleasure after she was worn out and her husband was old. The Lord's answer did not explain a physical process. It asked whether anything was too hard for him. Then the answer was attached once more to an event they would be able to recognize. Sarah holding the son she had not believed her aged body could bear. For the moment she stood inside the tent, having been confronted over laughter she tried to deny. The visitors remained with Abraham beneath the oaks. The meal had been eaten, the promise reaffirmed, and Sarah's hidden response brought into the open. But their arrival at Mamre concerned more than the birth inside Abraham's household. Beyond the tent, lay the valley where Lot had placed himself beside Sodom, and the visitors were about to turn their attention there. The men rose and looked down towards Sodom. Abraham walked with them to send them on their way. The promise of Isaac remained inside Abraham's household, fixed to the coming year. But the future announced over Abraham had always extended beyond his own family. He was to become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth would be blessed through him. That calling now became part of the Lord's decision to disclose what was approaching. "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" The question placed Abraham in a new position. He was not one of the kings governing the cities of the valley. He had refused the goods of Sodom after rescuing its people, yet what was about to happen there would not be kept from him. The Lord identified why. Abraham would surely become a great and mighty nation. All the nations of the earth would be blessed through him. God had chosen him so that he would command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. That purpose reached into the household still waiting for Isaac. Abraham was not merely to produce descendants, he was to direct those descendants in a particular way of life. The promised nation was to be shaped by righteousness and justice. Then the Lord would bring about what he had promised Abraham. The future depended upon God's fulfillment, but Abraham's responsibility within that future was active. He would command his children and the generations of his household. The man who had asked how he could know that he would possess the land now learned that his descendants were to live within it, according to the justice of the God who gave it. That made the disclosure concerning Sodom directly relevant to Abraham's calling. The Lord said, "Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know." The wickedness of Sodom had already been identified when Lot moved his tents near the city. Now that wickedness had produced an outcry. The language carried more than a general reputation. Something had risen from the cities as a demand for judgment, and the Lord described their sin as exceedingly grave. Yet judgment would not proceed as an unexamined response to the outcry. The Lord declared that he would go down and see. What happened to the cities would correspond to what was actually found there. The men turned away and went towards Sodom. Abraham remained standing before the Lord. The visitors were moving toward the city where Lot lived, and Abraham had just heard that its sin was under divine examination. The king of Sodom had once fled from Chedorlaomer's army. Abram had pursued the invaders and brought the people back. Now the danger facing the city did not come from another king. It came from the judge whose authority Melchizedek had described as extending over heaven and earth. Abraham drew near. His first question went directly to the relationship between the innocent and the guilty. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? The threatened city contained people, not merely a collective name. If judgment fell upon the place as a whole, what would happen to any righteous people living within it? Abraham proposed a number. Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? His appeal expanded from the lives of the 50 to the preservation of the entire place. He asked whether the presence of 50 righteous people would be enough for God to spare the city around them. Then Abraham stated the principle on which he was appealing. Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. He repeated the protest. Far be that from you. Then he asked, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? Abraham had been chosen to command his household to practice righteousness and justice. Now he appealed to the justice of God himself. His plea did not treat mercy and justice as opposites. He asked for the city to be spared because it would be unjust for the righteous to be swept away as though they were indistinguishable from the wicked. The title Abraham used carried the question beyond Sodom. The one deciding the city's fate was the judge of all the earth. His judgment over Sodom had to be consistent with his justice everywhere. The Lord answered Abraham, "If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake." The first request was granted. If 50 righteous people were found, the city itself would be spared because of them. Their presence would affect not only their own survival, but the fate of the whole population. Abraham continued. He acknowledged the distance between himself and the one he addressed. "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes." The man promised descendants like the dust of the earth now described himself as dust and ashes. He had approached the judge of all the earth, and he knew he was asking for the fate of a city whose grave sin had produced an outcry. His next question reduced the number slightly. "Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? The question exposed the difficulty of a fixed threshold. If 50 would preserve the city, would 45 be insufficient simply because 5 were missing? The Lord answered, "I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. The city would not fall for lack of 5. Abraham spoke again. "Suppose 40 are found there." The Lord replied, "For the sake of 40 I will not do it." The appeal was moving downward, and each answer established the same principle. The righteous could preserve the place for their sake, even as their number decreased. Abraham continued carefully, "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there." The Lord said, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." Abraham's language showed that he understood the boldness of continuing. He had already received assurances concerning 50, 45, and 40. He now asked the Lord not to be angry as he moved to 30. The answer remained merciful. If 30 righteous people were found, the city would not be destroyed. Abraham spoke again. "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there." The Lord answered, "For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it." The number had now fallen far below Abraham's first proposal. 50 righteous people could preserve Sodom. So could 45, 40, 30, or 20. Abraham made one more request. "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again but this once. Suppose 10 are found there." He marked this as his final appeal. He did not continue by ones, or ask how few righteous people might still be delivered. He stopped at 10 and waited for the answer. The Lord said, "For the sake of 10 I will not destroy it. The full city would be spared if 10 righteous people were found within it." With that answer, Abraham's intercession ended. He had begun by asking whether the righteous would be swept away with the wicked. The Lord had answered by agreeing to spare the entire place for the sake of a righteous group. Abraham then reduced the proposed number, step by step, until he reached 10. At every stage, the Lord agreed. The exchange revealed the breadth of mercy available to the city. Sodom's wickedness was great, and its sin was very grave. The outcry had reached the Lord. Even so, 10 righteous people would be enough to preserve the entire place. But Abraham was not told that 10 would be found. The promise to spare Sodom was conditional each time. If the Lord found the stated number of righteous people there, he would not destroy it. The conversation established what God would do for 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, and 10. It did not establish which number described the city. That left the outcome suspended between two known realities. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah was great. The judge of all the earth would act justly and would spare the city for 10 righteous people. The investigation would determine what followed. When the Lord finished speaking with Abraham, he went his way. Abraham returned to his place. The conversation had changed Abraham's knowledge, but not his control over the city. He knew why the men were traveling toward Sodom. He knew that the city's sin had produced a great outcry. He knew that the Lord intended to examine the matter, and he knew the conditions under which the place would be spared. Abraham's role had been to intercede. He had approached, asked, challenged the possibility of indiscriminate destruction, and appealed to the justice of the judge of all the earth. He had continued until the number reached 10. Then the exchange ended. The moment also showed what Abraham's calling to righteousness and justice required from him before he had any children to command. He did not receive the disclosure as distant information about a corrupt city. He drew near and spoke for the possibility of righteous people living within it. His appeal reached beyond his own household. The promised blessing to the nations stood beside a city under judgment, and Abraham asked whether a righteous remnant could preserve the whole. The Lord's answers showed that the wicked would benefit if enough righteous people were found among them. The city did not have to deserve preservation as a whole. 10 righteous people would be sufficient for the Lord to spare it. That promise made the unanswered count decisive. Abraham had rescued Sodom once by military action. Then he knew the enemy, gathered trained men, pursued the captors, and brought back the people and goods. This time he could not follow the danger with armed servants. The judgment belonged to God, and Abraham's intervention took the form of questions and pleas. When the conversation ended, the men who had left Mamre were still moving towards Sodom. They carried no request from Abraham and no negotiated number to present to the city. The condition had been established before the judge. If 10 righteous people were found there, Sodom would be spared. Lot was inside that city with his household. He had once been captured because he lived there, and Abraham had brought him back. The present danger would reach deeper than the army of Chedorlaomer. It would examine the character of Sodom itself. Abraham returned to his place without hearing a verdict. The Lord had not told him that Sodom would be destroyed, and he had not told him that it would be spared. He had revealed the outcry, the gravity of the sin, the investigation, and the mercy available for the sake of 10. The rest would unfold within the city. The appeal was finished. The messengers were approaching Sodom, and the first household they would meet there belonged to Lot. By evening, the 2 angels reached Sodom. Lot was sitting at the city gate. When he saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed with his face to the ground. "My lords," he said, "please turn aside to your servant's house. Spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way." They initially refused. "No, we will spend the night in the square." Lot urged them strongly. They accepted his invitation and entered his house. He prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread. The visitors ate. The meal began in a way that resembled their reception at Abraham's tent. Lot saw travelers, went to meet them, bowed, offered shelter, and placed food before them. But the setting was the city whose sin had produced an outcry before the Lord, and the danger emerged before the visitors lay down for the night. The men of Sodom surrounded Lot's house. They came from across the city, both young and old, all the people to the last man. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." The demand revealed the city through collective action. The strangers had entered Lot's house for shelter. Now the men of Sodom gathered around the building and demanded that Lot surrender them for sexual violation. Lot went outside to speak with them. He shut the door behind him, placing himself between the crowd and the visitors inside. "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." Then Lot offered an appalling substitute. He told the crowd that he had 2 daughters who had never known a man. He offered to bring them out and let the men do to them as they pleased, if only they would leave the visitors alone. "For they have come under the shelter of my roof," he said. Lot correctly named the crowd's demand as wickedness, but his answer exposed his daughters to the same violence he was trying to prevent against his guests. The crisis inside Sodom had reached his own door, and his attempt to manage it placed members of his household in danger. The crowd rejected him. "Stand back!" Then they turned their contempt upon Lot. "This fellow came to sojourn, and he has become the judge." Lot had settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. By this night he was sitting at its gate and living in a house there. Yet the men surrounding him still defined him as an outsider who had come to sojourn. His appeal against their wickedness was treated as judgment from a foreigner who had no authority over them. They threatened him. "Now we will deal worse with you than with them." The crowd pressed hard against Lot and moved toward the door to break it down. The visitors inside acted before the men of Sodom could enter. They reached out, pulled Lot back into the house, and shut the door. Then they struck the men at the entrance with blindness, from the least to the greatest. The crowd wore itself out, trying to find the door. The blow prevented the assault without changing the intent of those outside. Even blinded, the men continued searching for an entrance until exhaustion overtook their effort. Inside the house, the visitors spoke to Lot with urgency. "Have you anyone else here?" They told him to bring out anyone belonging to him in the city, sons, daughters, sons-in-law, and anyone else connected to his household. "We are about to destroy this place," they said, "because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it." The investigation announced to Abraham had reached its result. The men who came to Sodom had witnessed the city gather around Lot's house in a united attempt to violate his guests. The outcry was great, and destruction was now declared. Lot went out to warn the men who were to marry his daughters. "Up! Get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." They regarded him as though he were joking. His warning did not move them to leave. The night passed toward morning, with the announced destruction still approaching. When dawn came, the angels urged Lot to act. "Up! Take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." The distinction between those inside and outside Lot's house had become final. His prospective sons-in-law remained in Sodom. His wife and 2 daughters were with him. The angels ordered those 4 to leave before judgment overtook the city. Lot lingered. The warning was direct. The attackers at the door had revealed the city's condition. The angels had stated why they were there and what the Lord was about to do. Dawn had arrived. Still, Lot delayed. The men seized him by the hand. They also took the hands of his wife and his 2 daughters. They did this because the Lord was merciful to him. Lot's rescue, therefore, did not depend on the speed of his response. The angels did not leave him to the consequences of lingering. They physically grasped the family and brought them outside the city. Once they were out, one of the messengers gave Lot a strict command: "Escape for your life." He was not to look behind him. He was not to stop anywhere in the plain. He was to escape to the hills so that he would not be swept away. The command required complete separation from the place Lot had chosen. He could carry no portion of the city's life forward by remaining within the plain or turning back toward it. His survival depended on reaching the hills. Lot appealed for a different destination. "Oh no, my lords." He acknowledged the favor shown to him and the great kindness by which his life had been saved. But he said he could not escape to the hills because the disaster would overtake him and he would die. Then he pointed to a nearby city. It was close enough to flee to, and it was small. "Let me escape there, is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." The messenger granted the request. "Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken." Lot's plea changed the immediate shape of the judgment. The small city he selected would be spared so that he could reach it. The messenger told him to hurry. "I can do nothing until you arrive there." Because Lot repeatedly called the city small, it became known as Zoar. The sun had risen over the land when Lot entered Zoar. Then The Lord rained sulfur and fire upon Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of heaven. The destruction overturned the cities, the entire plain, the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew from the ground. The well-watered valley Lot had once surveyed was devastated. Its abundance had determined his choice when he separated from Abram. Now the cities, their inhabitants, and the growth of the land were consumed in judgment. The command given to Lot's family had included one specific restraint. They were not to look back. Lot's wife was behind him. She looked back. She became a pillar of salt. Lot reached Zoar with his 2 daughters, but his wife did not complete the escape with them. The woman who had left Sodom by the hand of the angels turned toward the destroyed plain and was lost within the judgment from which the family had been pulled. The rescue therefore carried grief inside it. Lot survived. His daughters survived. The small city he requested was spared for his arrival, but the household that had lived in Sodom did not emerge intact. His prospective sons-in-law had dismissed his warning, and his wife became a pillar of salt after looking back. The destruction also settled the question left open after Abraham's intercession. The Lord had agreed to spare Sodom if 50 righteous people were found there. He had repeated that agreement as Abraham reduced the number to 45, 40, 30, 20, and 10. Sodom was not spared. The judge of all the earth had gone down to see whether the city's condition matched the outcry. The men of Sodom then gathered from across the city around Lot's house, demanded his guests, rejected his plea, threatened him, and tried to break through his door. Judgment followed the verified wickedness, yet mercy remained active within the destruction. The angels warned Lot, gave him time to gather his household, urged him at dawn, and seized his family when he lingered. They granted his request to flee to Zoar. The small city remained standing because Lot needed a place he said he could reach, and behind Lot's deliverance stood the man who had remained before the Lord and pleaded for the fate of Sodom. Early that morning, Abraham returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah and across the whole land of the plain. Smoke rose from the land like the smoke of a furnace. That was all Abraham could see from where he stood. He had ended his appeal without receiving a verdict. Now the smoke showed him the answer. The cities had fallen. Abraham had once seen Lot lift his eyes toward that valley because it was well watered everywhere. He had allowed Lot to choose it and had moved in the opposite direction to preserve peace between their households. Later, when kings carried Lot away from Sodom, Abraham had pursued them and brought him back. This time, Abraham had stood before the Lord rather than before an army. He had argued that the righteous must not be swept away with the wicked and asked whether 10 righteous people could preserve the city. The city was destroyed, but Lot was brought out of the catastrophe. When God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham. He sent Lot away from the midst of the overthrow. Lot's rescue was therefore joined directly to Abraham, even though Abraham did not travel to Sodom. Enter Lot's house, or lead him out. God remembered the man who had interceded and removed his kinsman from the destruction. The result answered Abraham's plea in a form different from the preservation of the city. Sodom was not spared for Lot's sake. Lot was spared from Sodom's fate for Abraham's sake. The distinction mattered. The wickedness of the city had reached the point of judgment, and the entire place could not be preserved. Mercy operated by separating Lot from it. That separation was far more severe than the one Abraham had proposed years before. When Abram and Lot first divided, Abram let Lot choose left or right. Lot chose the Jordan Valley and moved east. He settled among its cities and brought his tents near Sodom. Now Lot was removed with nothing in his control over the process. Angels pulled him by the hand. The plain was forbidden to him. The city where he lived was destroyed. The wife who left beside him did not survive the escape. Abraham remained outside the plain, looking at smoke. He had no captured people to restore and no goods to refuse. The judgment had left no city waiting to receive its inhabitants back. His role ended where it began, standing before the Lord and then returning to his own place. The immediate danger surrounding Lot had passed, but the consequences of his choice had not. He was alive in Zoar with 2 daughters. His former home was gone. The men who were to marry his daughters had remained behind. His wife stood as a pillar of salt within the ruined landscape. For Abraham, the destruction closed one crisis, while the central promise of his own household remained ahead. Sarah had been told that she would bear a son at the appointed time. The visitors who announced that birth had gone from Abraham's table towards Sodom, and the valley had now been judged. Smoke rose where Lot had chosen to live. Abraham still had to continue through the land with Sarah, waiting for the child whose birth had been promised within the year. Lot did not remain in Zoar. He was afraid to live there, so he left the small city and went into the hills with his 2 daughters. The destination he had resisted during the escape now became the place he chose after Sodom was gone. The 3 of them lived in a cave. Lot's older daughter spoke to the younger. "Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth." She proposed that they give their father wine and lie with him so they could preserve offspring through him. The sisters had escaped the destruction of their city, but their prospective husbands had remained behind. Their mother had died during the flight. In the cave, the older daughter defined their situation as the end of any ordinary path to children and devised a plan through Lot himself. That night, they gave their father wine. The older daughter went in and lay with him. Lot did not know when she lay down or when she rose. The next day, the older daughter told the younger what she had done. "Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father." They gave Lot wine on the second night. The younger daughter lay with him. Again, Lot did not know when she lay down or when she rose. Both daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter bore a son and named him Moab. He became the father of the Moabites. The younger daughter also bore a son. She named him Ben-Ami, and he became the father of the Ammonites. Lot's separation from Abraham had begun with a choice made in full view of a fertile valley. It ended with his family line continuing through his daughters in a cave. The cities that attracted him were gone. The household that entered Sodom had been reduced to Lot, and the 2 daughters pulled from its destruction. From that fractured remnant came 2 peoples. Abraham, meanwhile, journeyed toward the territory of the Negeb. He lived between Kadesh and Shur, and then sojourned in Gerar. The appointed year for Sarah's son was moving forward, but in Gerar, Abraham repeated the strategy he had used in Egypt. He said of Sarah, "She is my sister." Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. The same danger returned under conditions that made the stakes even sharper. Sarah had now been explicitly identified as the mother of Isaac. God had promised that she would bear Abraham a son at the appointed time. Yet she was again taken into the house of another ruler, because Abraham presented her as his sister. In Egypt, Pharaoh learned the truth only after the Lord struck his household with plagues. In Gerar, God confronted the king before he approached Sarah. God came to Abimelech in a dream during the night. "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife." The warning was absolute. Abimelech had taken a married woman, and his life was under judgment because of it. But Abimelech had not touched Sarah. He answered, "Lord, will you kill an innocent nation?" Then he described what he had been told by both Abraham and Sarah. "Did he not himself say to me, 'She is my sister'? And she herself said, "He is my brother." Abimelech had acted on their matching statements. Abraham concealed the marriage, and Sarah confirmed the relationship Abraham presented. Abimelech continued, "In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands I have done this." God acknowledged that claim. "Yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart." Then God revealed that Abimelech's restraint had itself been an act of divine protection. "It was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her." Abimelech's ignorance explained his initial action, but it did not make continued possession of Sarah permissible. God had prevented him from touching her, preserving both Abimelech from sin and Sarah from a union that would threaten the clarity of the promised birth. The command was immediate. "Now then, return the man's wife." God identified Abraham as a prophet. Abraham would pray for Abimelech, and Abimelech would live. But refusal carried the full warning first, spoken in the dream. "If you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours." The solution required more than Abimelech's continued restraint. Sarah had to be restored to Abraham. The king whose life was threatened would then depend on the prayer of the man whose deception had placed him under that threat. Abimelech rose early in the morning. He called all his servants and told them everything that had happened. The men were very afraid. Then Abimelech summoned Abraham. "What have you done to us?" he asked. "And how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin?" The king had taken Sarah because Abraham called her his sister. Now he knew that the act had exposed both himself and his kingdom to judgment. "You have done to me things that ought not to be done." Abimelech pressed the question further. "What did you see that you did this thing?" Abraham answered with the calculation behind his conduct. "I did it because I thought, there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife." The fear was the same one he had expressed before entering Egypt. Sarah's beauty would reveal her as desirable, and Abraham expected that men would kill the husband in order to take the wife. But Abraham added information he had not given Abimelech at the beginning. "Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife." The statement explained how Abraham and Sarah could both use the words brother and sister while concealing the more important truth of their marriage. Their claim rested on a real family relationship, but it caused Abimelech to act without knowing that Sarah was another man's wife. Abraham then explained that the arrangement had not begun in Gerar. "When God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother.'" The deception was therefore a standing agreement between Abraham and Sarah during their travels. Gerar had not created it. The fear Abraham described had shaped how they presented their relationship wherever they went. That admission revealed why the same crisis appeared twice. In Egypt, Abram asked Sarai to identify him as her brother before they entered the land. In Gerar, the older Abraham and Sarah continued the same arrangement even after receiving new names, covenant promises, and a fixed announcement concerning Isaac's birth. The danger had not come from Abimelech discovering the marriage and killing Abraham. It came from Abimelech believing the claim and taking Sarah. Once again, divine intervention accomplished what the strategy did not. God protected Abraham's life, preserved Sarah, restrained the foreign ruler, and forced the hidden marriage into the open. Abimelech then acted publicly and materially to correct the wrong. He gave Abraham sheep, cattle, male servants and female servants. He restored Sarah to him. Then he placed the land before Abraham. "Behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you." Abraham had entered Gerar expecting that the absence of fear of God would endanger him. Abimelech instead returned Sarah, gave Abraham livestock and servants, and allowed him to live anywhere within his territory. The king also addressed Sarah. "Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver." By calling Abraham her brother, Abimelech used the very relationship they had presented, but he attached the payment to Sarah's public vindication. "It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated." Sarah had been taken into Abimelech's house under the appearance that she was free to be taken. Her restoration and the payment now established before others that she had not been approached and that the threatened union had not occurred. The result protected the identity of the child she was promised to bear. God had said that Isaac would be Abraham's son through Sarah. Abimelech's dream, his restraint, Sarah's return, and her public vindication preserved that declaration immediately before its fulfillment. Then Abraham prayed to God. God healed Abimelech. He also healed Abimelech's wife and his female servants, and they bore children. The Lord had closed every womb in Abimelech's household because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. The physical condition of the women in Gerar had been tied directly to the king's possession of her. Once Sarah was restored and Abraham prayed, their ability to bear children returned. The reversal gathered the entire crisis into one final contrast. Sarah had been taken into a household where the wombs were closed because of her presence. She was then returned to Abraham, and through Abraham's prayer, those women were enabled to bear again. Sarah's own womb still stood at the center of the greater promise. Abimelech had learned in the dream that she was a man's wife. He had learned from Abraham that she was also his half-sister. He had learned through divine warning that taking her had placed his life and kingdom in danger. And he had learned that Abraham, despite causing the crisis, was the prophet whose prayer would bring healing. Abraham's position was equally complex. His fear led him to present Sarah as his sister. That presentation allowed the king to take her. Yet God did not abandon the promise because Abraham repeated the deception. He intervened before Abimelech touched Sarah, ordered her return, identified Abraham as a prophet, and required the king to receive Abraham's prayer. The promised blessing was moving through a deeply flawed household without becoming dependent on the flawlessness of the people carrying it. Abraham's deception brought danger to Gerar, but his intercession brought healing. Sarah's concealment helped place her inside Abimelech's house, but divine restraint preserved her and her promised son. Abimelech's action threatened his life, but his integrity in acting on what he had been told was acknowledged, and his obedience led to restoration. The crisis ended with each relationship correctly identified. Sarah was Abraham's wife. Abraham was God's prophet. Abimelech was the king warned and then healed, and the women of Gerar could bear children again. The appointed promise inside Abraham's household had survived famine, Pharaoh's house, years of barrenness, the arrangement with Hagar, Abraham's laughter, Sarah's laughter, and now Abimelech's possession of Sarah. The time announced at Mamre had arrived. Sarah was back with Abraham. The marriage was publicly restored. The danger of Gerar had passed. Around them, wombs once closed were opened, and now the woman whose own womb had defined the long impossibility would receive exactly what the Lord had promised. The Lord attended to Sarah exactly as he had promised. Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the appointed time God had named. The child was born within the year announced at Mamre. Sarah's age had not changed the promise. Abraham's laughter had not changed it. Sarah's laughter had not changed it. The dangers in Gerar had not changed it. Abraham named the son Isaac. On the 8th day he circumcised him as God had commanded. Isaac entered the household under the covenant sign from infancy. Ishmael had received that sign at 13, on the day Abraham and every male in his house were circumcised. Isaac received it according to the command governing future generations. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. The age he had named while laughing before God now became the age at which he held the promised son. Sarah spoke about the reversal. God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. The laughter that once expressed disbelief had become laughter created by fulfillment. The promised name now belonged to a living child, and Sarah understood that others would share in the astonishment of his birth. She continued, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." The question answered the long history of barrenness without repeating its pain. Sarah was nursing the child she had been unable to imagine bearing. Abraham had the son through whom God said the covenant would continue. Isaac grew and was weaned. On the day he was weaned, Abraham prepared a great feast. The celebration marked the child's continued growth. Isaac had survived birth and infancy and reached another stage of life. The household gathered around the son, whose arrival had been promised for decades, but the feast also brought the relationship between Abraham's two sons into open conflict. Sarah saw Ishmael, the son Hagar, the Egyptian, had borne to Abraham, laughing. The sight moved Sarah to demand a permanent separation. "Cast out this slave woman with her son," she told Abraham, "for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac." Sarah's words joined Hagar's status to the question of inheritance. She did not ask only that Ishmael be disciplined or removed from the feast. She demanded that Hagar and her son be driven from the household so that Ishmael would not share the inheritance with Isaac. The demand was deeply distressing to Abraham because Ishmael was his son. He had fathered Ishmael before Isaac's birth had been announced. He had watched him grow for 13 years before God named Sarah as Isaac's mother. He had pleaded that Ishmael might live before God and had received a promise that Ishmael would become a great nation. Now, Sarah wanted him sent away. God spoke to Abraham about both the boy and Hagar. "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman." Abraham was to listen to Sarah. "Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named." Sarah's demand concerning inheritance matched the distinction God had already made. Ishmael was Abraham's son, but Isaac was the son through whom the covenant line would be named. God then reaffirmed Ishmael's future. "I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring." The separation would not cancel the blessing over Ishmael. His life and descendants remained under the promise first given to Hagar and later confirmed to Abraham. He would become a nation because he too descended from Abraham, but he would become that nation outside the household where Isaac held the central inheritance. Abraham rose early the next morning. He took bread and a skin of water. He gave them to Hagar, placing them on her shoulder, and sent her away with the boy. The decision Abraham found distressing was carried out without delay after God told him to listen to Sarah. Hagar left the household a second time. The first time, she had fled from Sarai's harsh treatment while pregnant. This time, Abraham himself sent her away with their son. Hagar wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. The water in the skin ran out. She placed the boy under one of the bushes and went away from him. She sat down about the distance of a bow shot from where he lay. "Let me not look on the death of the child," she said. Hagar sat opposite him and raised her voice and wept. The promise of a great nation now stood in direct tension with the boy's condition in the wilderness. Ishmael had survived the conflict within Abraham's household only to face the loss of water after being sent away. God heard the voice of the boy. The angel of God called to Hagar from heaven. "What troubles you, Hagar?" Then came the command she had received in another form years earlier. "Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." Ishmael's name again became the pattern of his life. Before his birth, the Lord had heard Hagar's affliction and told her to name him Ishmael. Now, when the water was gone and Hagar sat at a distance because she did not want to see him die, God heard the boy. The angel told Hagar to rise. "Lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation." The future promised to Ishmael required his present survival. Hagar was not to remain at a distance waiting for his death. She was to take hold of him, because God's promise still stood. Then God opened Hagar's eyes. She saw a well of water. Hagar went to it, filled the skin, and gave the boy a drink. The crisis ended through provision near the place where she had expected death. The empty water skin had driven her away from her son. The well allowed her to return and sustain him. God was with the boy as he grew. Ishmael lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He settled in the wilderness of Paran. Hagar obtained a wife for him from Egypt. The child once carried in her body as an Egyptian servant now formed an adult household connected to her own land of origin. Ishmael's path had separated from Isaac's, but it had not disappeared. God's promise accompanied him into the wilderness, and the line that would become a great nation continued. Isaac remained with Abraham and Sarah as the named heir. The separation had therefore established distinct futures for the brothers. Isaac carried the covenant line within Abraham's household. Ishmael carried a promise of nationhood outside it. Both lived because God intervened. Isaac lived because God enabled Sarah to bear at the appointed time. Ishmael lived because God heard him in the wilderness and opened Hagar's eyes to water. During that period, another issue arose near Beersheba. Abimelech came to Abraham with Phicol, the commander of his army. The king, who had once confronted Abraham over Sarah, now approached because of what he had observed about Abraham's life. "God is with you in all that you do," Abimelech said. He asked Abraham to swear by God that he would not deal falsely with Abimelech, his children, or his descendants. Abraham was to show the same kindness to Abimelech and to the land where he had lived as a sojourner that Abimelech had shown to him. The request acknowledged Abraham's growing strength and the visible favor surrounding him. Abimelech did not approach to expel him. He sought a binding promise that Abraham's future conduct would remain peaceful toward his house and territory. Abraham agreed. "I will swear." But before the covenant was completed, Abraham raised a grievance. Abimelech's servants had seized a well of water. For a man living as a sojourner with livestock and a large household, the well was a concrete point of survival. Abraham had dug it, but servants belonging to the king had taken control of it. Abimelech answered that he did not know who had done it. "You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today." The king denied prior knowledge rather than defending the seizure. Abraham had now placed the matter before him directly. Abraham took sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech. The two men made a covenant. Then Abraham set 7 ewe lambs from the flock apart. Abimelech noticed the separate group and asked, "What is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart?" Abraham explained that Abimelech was to accept the 7 lambs from his hand as a witness that Abraham had dug the well. The gift established the claim before both men. Abraham would continue to use the water not merely because he had asserted ownership, but because Abimelech had accepted the animals serving as witness to Abraham's work. The place was called Beersheba because the two men swore an oath there. The dispute ended through direct acknowledgement and covenant rather than force. Abraham had once armed his household to rescue Lot from kings. Here he secured the well by confronting Abimelech, exchanging animals, establishing a witness, and binding the agreement with an oath. After making the covenant at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol rose and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham remained. He planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. The act joined the well and the oath to Abraham's continuing worship. Earlier altars had marked Shechem, the region between Bethel and Ai, and the oaks of Mamre. At Beersheba, Abraham planted a tree and invoked the God whose covenant stretched through generations. He sojourned in the land of the Philistines for many days. The word still describing his residence was sojourn. Abraham had gained recognized use of a well and had entered a covenant with the local king, but he continued to live as one whose permanent possession of the larger land remained in the future. Even so, his position had changed dramatically since his first arrival in Canaan. He now had the promised son through Sarah. He had received public recognition from Abimelech that God was with him. He had secured the well his servants dug. He had formed a peaceful covenant, protecting his relationship with the king and the king's descendants. And he could remain at Beersheba with water, flocks, servants, and a growing heir. The pain surrounding Ishmael remained part of that stability. The well at Beersheba stood in the same wilderness where Hagar's water had run out. Abraham occupied the place under covenant, while Hagar and Ishmael survived outside his household. Through another well, God enabled her to see. The two branches of Abraham's family now lived apart. The separation Sarah demanded had taken place. The distinction God declared had taken place. Through Isaac, Abraham's offspring would be named. Through Ishmael, another great nation would arise. At Beersheba, Isaac's future seemed more secure than it had at any earlier point. He had been born, circumcised, weaned, and established as sole heir beside Sarah. The competing inheritance claim had been removed from the household. Abraham had a recognized place to dwell and a covenant governing peace with Abimelech. The promise was no longer represented only by words, stars, dust, or divided animals. It had a face and a name. Isaac lived in Abraham's tents, and the next command would place that very life, the son, the heir, and the visible future of the covenant, into Abraham's hands as something he was ordered to give back. God tested Abraham. He called his name, Abraham. Abraham answered, "Here I am." Then came the command, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah." God told Abraham to offer Isaac there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains he would identify. Every part of the command concentrated the cost. Isaac was Abraham's son. He held a unique place as the son of Sarah and the sole bearer of the named covenant line. Abraham loved him, and Abraham was now told to take him to a place God would show and offer him there. The journey echoed Abraham's first call. Years earlier, God had told him to leave his country, his kindred, and his father's house for a land that would be shown to him. Abraham departed with promises still ahead. Now God again named a journey before naming its precise destination. But this time, Abraham was not being asked to leave his past behind. He was being asked to surrender the future that had finally arrived. The command did not merely threaten Abraham's affection for his son. It placed the promises themselves under pressure. God had said that Sarah would bear Isaac. God had said that the everlasting covenant would be established with Isaac and his descendants. God had said that Abraham's offspring would be named through Isaac. Now God commanded Abraham to offer Isaac as a burnt offering before Isaac had produced the descendants attached to his name. Abraham rose early the next morning. He saddled his donkey and took 2 young men with him. He also took Isaac. Abraham cut wood for the burnt offering. Then they set out for the place God had named. The preparation was deliberate. The donkey was saddled. The servants were selected. The wood was cut. Isaac traveled with Abraham. Each action moved the command from spoken words toward completion. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from a distance. The journey had lasted long enough for the mountain to remain ahead of them through successive days. When the destination finally came into view, Abraham stopped the young men. "Stay here with the donkey." He told them that he and Isaac would go farther. "I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." Abraham spoke of both of them returning. Then he prepared to continue in obedience to a command that required Isaac's death. He took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on Isaac. Abraham carried the fire and the knife. Father and son continued together. The objects divided between them revealed the shape of the offering before Isaac understood it. Isaac bore the wood. Abraham held the means to light the sacrifice and the blade needed to kill it. As they walked, Isaac spoke, "My father." Abraham answered with the same words he had used when God called his name. "Here I am, my son." Isaac saw what they carried. "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" It was the necessary question. They had left the donkey and servants behind. The wood was on Isaac's back. Abraham had the fire and knife. The animal required for the offering was missing. Abraham answered, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." Then the two continued together. Abraham's answer did not change their direction. They kept moving toward the place God had shown him. Isaac continued carrying the wood, and Abraham continued carrying the fire and knife. When they reached the place, Abraham built an altar. He arranged the wood. Then he bound Isaac. The promised son became the offering. Abraham placed him on the altar. On top of the wood, Isaac had carried up the mountain. The command had reached its sharpest point. Isaac was no longer simply traveling beside Abraham. He was bound upon the structure prepared for his death. Abraham reached out his hand. He took the knife to kill his son. At that instant, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." The name was repeated with urgency. Abraham answered, "Here I am." The response was the same, but the command was now reversed. "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him." Abraham's raised hand was stopped before the knife came down. The angel continued, "For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." The test had reached its completion without Isaac's death. Abraham had obeyed through the departure, the 3-day journey, the separation from the servants, the ascent with Isaac, the construction of the altar, the binding, and the raised knife. He had not withheld the son identified in the command, but God did not permit Abraham to kill him. The promise had been brought to the point of apparent loss and then preserved by a voice from heaven. Isaac remained bound on the wood, alive, while Abraham received the prohibition against harming him. Then Abraham looked up. Behind him was a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. The animal Isaac had asked about was now visible. Abraham went and took the ram. He offered it as a burnt offering instead of his son. The substitution was exact. An offering was still made. The altar and wood were still used. A life was given. But the ram occupied the place where Isaac had been bound. The son, through whom the covenant would continue, was released, and the animal God provided was offered in his place. Abraham named that place, "The Lord will provide." The name preserved his answer to Isaac's question. On the way up the mountain, Abraham had said that God would provide the lamb for himself. At the altar, a ram appeared at the moment Abraham was stopped from killing Isaac. The place became connected to the saying, "On the mountain of the Lord it shall be provided." Provision did not mean that the command had been painless or that obedience had stopped before it became costly. Abraham had traveled for 3 days and bound the son he loved. The provision came at the point when the knife was in his hand. The result revealed that Isaac's life belonged to the promise before it belonged to Abraham's control. Abraham had once tried to secure an heir through Hagar. Sarah had once tried to preserve Isaac's inheritance by expelling Ishmael. Here neither arrangement, status, nor separation could protect Isaac. His survival came through God's interruption and God's substitute. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time. This time, the message was not a command to stop, it was an oath. "By myself I have sworn," declares the Lord. God attached the oath to what Abraham had done. "Because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you." The promises first given when Abraham left Haran were now reaffirmed after the offering of Isaac. God would multiply Abraham's offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand on the seashore. The two images gathered the scale of the promised family into heaven and earth. Years earlier, Abraham had been told to count the stars if he could. Now his descendants were also compared to the countless grains along the sea. God declared that Abraham's offspring would possess the gate of their enemies. The future would include opposition, but Abraham's line would prevail at the place where enemy strength was concentrated. Then the blessing extended again to the nations. "In your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." The promise first spoken at Abraham's departure had now passed through the testing of the chosen son. The blessing to the nations remained attached to Abraham's offspring, and Isaac's survival kept that future open. The reason stated in the oath was Abraham's obedience. He had heard the command to go and acted. He had taken Isaac. He had reached the mountain. He had not withheld the son he loved. And when the voice from heaven told him to stop, he stopped and accepted the ram provided in Isaac's place. The test therefore included obedience in both directions. Abraham obeyed when commanded to offer Isaac, and he obeyed when forbidden to harm him. He did not finish the act after God withdrew the command. The same hand that lifted the knife released Isaac and took the ram. The covenant future emerged from the mountain intact, but changed in meaning. Isaac remained the promised son, but his place could no longer be understood as something Abraham had achieved or secured for himself. Abraham had surrendered him in action, and God had returned his life through provision. The descendants compared to stars and sand would come through a son who had lain bound on an altar and lived because another life was offered instead. The blessing to all nations would move through a family that existed because God repeatedly created a future where human action reached its limit. Sarah could not produce Isaac through her own ability, yet God gave her a son. Abraham could not preserve Isaac by refusing the test, yet God stopped his hand. The promise survived not because it avoided impossibility, but because the God who made it provided beyond the point Abraham could carry it. Abraham returned to the young men waiting with the donkey. They rose and went together to Beersheba. Abraham lived there. The return completed the words he had spoken before ascending the mountain. He and the boy would go worship and come again. Abraham rejoined the servants, and the group traveled back. Isaac returned alive. The son had not been taken by famine, a foreign ruler, conflict with Ishmael, the wilderness, or the knife in Abraham's hand. At each stage, the covenant line had been preserved. On Moriah, the threat came through a direct command from God, and the preservation came through a direct command from the same voice. Abraham now possessed an oath added to the promise. God had sworn by himself to bless him, multiply his offspring, give them victory over their enemies, and bring blessing to all nations through them. The oath did not replace Isaac. It confirmed the future that required him. At Beersheba, Abraham could again see the son, whose absence would have emptied every promise of its visible path forward. Isaac had been given to Sarah after barrenness, separated from Ishmael as the named heir, laid on the altar, and released. But survival alone would not produce the generations compared to stars and sand. Isaac's line still had to continue beyond his own life. He had inherited a covenant and survived the test, but he had no wife and no child. The promise had come down from the mountain with him. Before it could move into another generation, Abraham's household would face death, the need for land that could truly be called its own, and the search for the woman who would share Isaac's future. After these events, Abraham received news from the family he had left behind. Milcah had borne children to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Their sons were Uz, the firstborn, followed by Buz, Kemuel, Chesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. Kemuel became the father of Aram. Bethuel became the father of Rebekah. That one name opened a future not yet visible within Abraham's household. Isaac had survived the mountain, but the generations promised through him would require another family bond. Rebekah now appeared among the descendants of Abraham's brother. Nahor's concubine, Roimah, also bore children, Tebah, Gaham, Tahash, and Maachah. The family Abraham had left when he obeyed the call to go continued growing at a distance. Nations and kings had been promised through Abraham, while Nahor's branch now included the woman who would become essential to the covenant line. Before that connection was pursued, death entered Abraham's household. Sarah lived 127 years. She died at Kiriath Arba, which was Hebron in the land of Canaan. The woman who had left Haran with Abraham traveled through Egypt and Gerar, endured years of barrenness, gave Hagar to her husband, received a new name, laughed at the promise, and bore Isaac at 90 had reached the end of her life. Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. The promise of descendants had been fulfilled through her body, but the promise of land had not yet given Abraham a place to bury her. Sarah died in Canaan, the territory promised to her offspring, while Abraham still lived there as a sojourner. His grief therefore created an immediate material need. Abraham rose from before his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites, "I am a sojourner and foreigner among you." He described his position exactly as it stood. God had promised all Canaan to his descendants, but Abraham approached the people living at Hebron without claiming ownership over their ground. "Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight." Abraham did not ask merely for permission to place Sarah in another person's tomb. He asked for property that would belong to him as a burial site. The Hittites answered with respect, "Hear us, my lord. You are a prince of God among us." They invited Abraham to bury Sarah in the choicest of their tombs. Each man would allow him to use a tomb, and none would withhold one from him. Their offer gave Abraham access, but Abraham continued pursuing ownership. He rose and bowed to the Hittites, the people of the land. Then he asked them to speak on his behalf to Ephron, son of Zohar. Ephron owned the cave of Machpelah at the end of his field. Abraham wanted Ephron to give him that cave for its full price in the presence of the people as property for a burial place. The request was precise. Abraham identified the owner. He identified the cave. He identified its location at the edge of the field. He offered the full price, and he required the transaction to occur before the gathered community. Abraham's purpose was not to rely on favor that could later be withdrawn or reinterpreted. The cave needed to pass from Ephron's possession into his own. Ephron was sitting among the Hittites. He answered Abraham within the hearing of everyone who entered the gate of the city. "No, my lord, hear me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it." Ephron expanded the property beyond the cave Abraham had requested. He offered both the field and the cave. "In the presence of the sons of my people I give it to you. Bury your dead." The offer was public. The Hittites at the city gate heard Ephron declare the transfer. Abraham bowed before the people of the land. Then he answered Ephron in their hearing, "If you will hear me, I give the price of the field. Accept it from me, that I may bury my dead there." Abraham would not take the property as an unpriced gift. He had once refused even a thread or sandal strap from the king of Sodom, so that the king could never say he had made Abraham rich. Here, when Sarah's burial required land, Abraham again insisted on a transaction that left the ownership clear. Ephron replied, "My lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead." The words supplied the price. Abraham listened to Ephron. He weighed out 400 shekels of silver according to the weights current among the merchants. The payment occurred in the hearing of the Hittites. Abraham did not reduce the amount Ephron named. He weighed the full 400 shekels and transferred it before those assembled at the gate. The field of Ephron at Machpelah, east of Mamre, was then established as Abraham's property. The transfer included the field, the cave within it, and all the trees inside the boundaries of the field. The details fixed what Abraham owned. The property was not an undefined permission to bury Sarah somewhere near Mamre. Its elements and boundaries were recognized: field, cave, and trees. The Hittites who entered the city gate witnessed the transaction. Only after the property had been secured did Abraham bury Sarah. He placed her in the cave of the field at Machpelah, east of Mamre, at Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The location joined several parts of Abraham's life. He had lived by the oaks of Mamre after separating from Lot. He had built an altar there. The Lord had appeared to him there with the announcement that Sarah would bear a son. Abraham had accompanied the visitors from that region as they looked towards Sodom. Now Sarah was buried nearby in land Abraham had purchased. The field and cave were confirmed to him as property for a burial place by the Hittites. For the first time, Abraham possessed a defined piece of Canaan recognized by the people of the land as legally his. It was not a kingdom, a city, or the broad territory promised to his descendants. It was a field containing a cave and trees, acquired because his wife had died. The first enduring possession came through burial. That outcome gave the land promise a solemn physical beginning. God had told Abraham to walk through the length and breadth of Canaan because it would be given to him. Abraham had sojourned at Shechem, Bethel, the Negeb, Mamre, Gerar, and Beersheba. He had dug a well and secured its use through an oath with Abimelech. But Sarah's death required property of a different kind. A well sustained a living household. A burial place held one generation while the next continued. The field at Machpelah did not move with Abraham's tents. Sarah's body made the family's connection to Canaan permanent. Wherever Abraham later traveled, the cave remained at Hebron, as land he had purchased and as the place where Sarah rested. The transaction also displayed Abraham's position between promise and possession. The Hittites called him a prince of God among them. They offered him their choicest tombs. Ephron publicly offered the field and cave, yet Abraham still introduced himself as a sojourner and foreigner. Honor did not equal ownership. Access did not equal ownership. Promise did not yet equal ownership. Abraham obtained ownership by identifying the property, naming the owner, requesting the full price, weighing the silver, and completing the transfer before witnesses. The field became his because every stage of the exchange was carried into public recognition. That clarity mattered beyond Sarah's burial. Abraham's descendants had been promised the whole land, but their first secure foothold was now a place that could not be dismissed as a temporary campsite. The cave belonged to Abraham and could remain within his family. Sarah's death also changed the shape of the covenant household. She had been named as the mother of nations and kings. She had borne the son through whom Abraham's offspring would be named. She had demanded that Ishmael be removed so Isaac would not share the inheritance. Now Isaac remained as the living result of her place within the promise, while Sarah herself rested in Machpelah. Abraham's mourning had moved into action because death could not wait for the wider land promise to be fulfilled. He needed a grave, and the need compelled him to secure property among the people already living there. The result was both smaller and more tangible than the territory God had described. The covenant boundaries stretched from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. Abraham's present possession consisted of one field and one cave, yet that field lay inside Canaan. It was held without conquest, ambiguity, or dependence on another owner's continued favor. Abraham had paid what was asked, and the people at the gate had witnessed the transfer. Sarah was buried in the land promised to her son. Her death did not end the pressure upon Abraham's household. It shifted that pressure toward Isaac. The son had survived the altar, but survival alone could not continue the line. Sarah was gone. Abraham was advancing in age. The promise of descendants beyond counting still rested upon Isaac, and Isaac's household had not yet begun. The family report concerning Nahor now carried new importance. Among Nahor and Milcah's descendants was Rebekah. Abraham had not left Isaac on the mountain, and he would not send him back toward the country Abraham had been commanded to leave. The future required a woman willing to come into Canaan and join the son of promise there. Sarah rested in a cave that Abraham owned. Isaac remained in the land she had entered with Abraham, and the aging father now had to secure the next generation without reversing the journey that had brought them there. Abraham was now old, advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed him in everything. He called the oldest servant of his household, the man who managed all that Abraham possessed. Abraham gave him a solemn responsibility. "Put your hand under my thigh," he said, "that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and God of the earth." The oath concerned Isaac's wife. Abraham commanded the servant not to choose a wife for Isaac from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom he lived. Instead, the servant was to travel to Abraham's country and kindred and obtain a wife there. The conditions protected the direction of Abraham's journey. Abraham had been called out from his country and relatives into Canaan. Isaac belonged to the promise within Canaan. The woman would come from Abraham's kin, but the son would not be moved back into the land Abraham had left. The servant immediately identified the difficulty. "Perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land." The mission depended on the consent of someone the servant had not yet met. Abraham could command his servant to travel, but the woman would have to agree to leave her household and come to Canaan. The servant asked whether Isaac should return to Abraham's former country if she refused. "Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came?" Abraham's answer was emphatic. "See to it that you do not take my son back there." Finding a wife was essential, but it could not be achieved by reversing Isaac's place in the promise. Abraham had left that land under God's command. Isaac had been born in Canaan, survived the altar, and remained the son through whom the descendants would be named. His marriage had to continue that future without carrying him away from the promised land. Abraham grounded the instruction in what God had already done. "The Lord, the God of heaven, took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred." God had spoken to Abraham and sworn that Canaan would be given to his offspring. "He will send his angel before you," Abraham told the servant, "and you shall take a wife for my son from there." Abraham expected divine action to precede the servant's work. The mission would involve travel, conversation, recognition, and consent, but its success rested on the God who had called Abraham away from that same family and promised the land to his descendants. The servant was not held responsible for forcing the outcome. "If the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine." The refusal of the woman would release him. But Abraham repeated the boundary. "Only you must not take my son back there." The distinction was exact. The servant must go. Isaac must remain. The woman must be willing. If she refused, the oath would end, rather than allowing the servant to change the mission. The servant placed his hand under Abraham's thigh and swore to carry out the matter. Then he prepared to leave. He took 10 of Abraham's camels and departed with goods from his master in his hand. The size of the company and the property he carried reflected the household he represented. He was not traveling on his own behalf. He acted under Abraham's oath to seek a wife for Abraham's son. The servant went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. When he arrived, he made the camels kneel outside the city beside a well of water. It was evening, the time when women came out to draw water. The servant had reached the region Abraham named, but a rival did not identify the woman. He needed to find someone from Abraham's kin, determine whether she was suited to the mission, and learn whether she would leave for Canaan. He prayed beside the well, "O Lord God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham." The prayer identified the mission as an extension of God's faithfulness to Abraham. The servant asked for success not as a private advantage, but as steadfast love shown to the man who had sent him. Then he described a specific sign. "Behold, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water." He would ask one young woman to lower her jar and give him a drink. If she answered by offering water not only to him, but also to his camels, she would be the woman God had appointed for Isaac. "By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master." The request tested more than whether a woman happened to arrive at the well. The servant would ask for a small act on his own behalf. The identifying response would go beyond his request and extend care to the animals with him. He had 10 camels. The woman named through the sign would have to notice the larger need and voluntarily continue drawing until the camels had finished. Before the servant had finished praying, Rebekah came out. She carried a water jar on her shoulder. She was the daughter of Bethuel, whose parents were Milcah and Nahor. The family connection Abraham required was already present, but the servant did not yet know her identity. Rebekah was very attractive and unmarried. No man had known her. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up. The servant ran to meet her. "Please, give me a little water to drink from your jar." His words followed the prayer exactly. He asked only for himself and only for a little water. Rebekah answered, "Drink, my lord." She quickly lowered the jar from her shoulder into her hands and gave him a drink. Then, after he had finished, she added the offer that would identify her. "I will draw water for your camels also, until they have finished drinking." The servant did not suggest it. Rebekah volunteered. She quickly emptied the remaining water from her jar into the trough. Then she ran back to the well to draw more. She continued drawing for all his camels. The answer to the servant's prayer unfolded through Rebekah's actions before he knew her name or family. She did not merely speak the sentence he had requested as a sign. She carried it through. She lowered the jar for the traveler. She emptied water into the trough. She returned to the well. She drew enough for 10 camels. The servant watched her in silence. He wanted to learn whether the Lord had prospered his journey. The exact response he had named was occurring in front of him, but the mission required more than generosity. Abraham had commanded him to find a woman from his country and kindred. The servant still needed to discover who Rebekah was. When the camels finished drinking, he took out a gold ring weighing 1/2 shekel and 2 gold bracelets weighing 10 shekels. Then he asked her, "Please tell me whose daughter you are." He also asked whether there was room in her father's house for them to spend the night. Rebekah answered the question of identity first. "I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor." The names joined Rebekah directly to Abraham's family. Nahor was Abraham's brother. Milcah was Nahor's wife. Bethuel was their son. Rebekah was Bethuel's daughter. The report Abraham had received after the testing of Isaac had named her place in that line. Now Abraham's servant stood beside her at the well after she had fulfilled the sign he requested in prayer. Rebekah then answered the question of lodging. "We have plenty of both straw and fodder, and room to spend the night. Her household could receive the traveler and provide for his camels. The welcome she had begun at the well could continue inside her family's home. The servant bowed his head and worshipped the Lord. His prayer had asked for success and for steadfast love to Abraham. He now understood the meeting as the answer. Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. Then he named the guidance he had received. As for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman. The servant had not first located Nahor's household and then selected Rebekah from among its daughters. He prayed at the well before learning who she was. Rebekah appeared before he finished. Her actions matched the sign. Only afterward did she reveal that she belonged to the precise family Abraham had named. The sequence gave the servant confidence that his journey had been directed. Abraham had said that the God of heaven would send his angel before him. At the well, the servant saw the result in a meeting whose details came together before he could arrange them. The right region, the right family, the voluntary act he had requested as a sign, the available hospitality needed for the next stage. The servant responded through worship before making any claim on Rebekah's future. The meeting solved the problem of recognition. It did not yet solve the problem of consent. Abraham had commanded the servant to take a wife for Isaac from his kin, but he had also released the servant from the oath if the woman was unwilling to come. Rebekah had agreed to draw water and provide lodging. She had not yet been asked to leave her family or travel to Canaan. The oath could not be fulfilled by the servant's private conclusion at the well. Rebekah belonged to a household. Her father was Bethuel. Nahor and Milcah stood behind that family line. The request had to enter their home, and the servant would have to explain why he had come, who Abraham had become, what Isaac represented, and how the meeting at the well had answered his prayer. The gifts in the servant's hand displayed Abraham's prosperity, but wealth alone could not release Rebekah. Abraham's name established the family connection, but kinship alone could not compel her. The servant's test identified her character through action, but the test alone did not complete the oath. The final condition remained the one the servant had raised before leaving Canaan. Would the woman be willing to follow him? At the well, Rebekah had already demonstrated the quality that made the question possible. She responded to a stranger's small request with sustained generosity. She saw the camels and took responsibility for watering them without being asked. She offered room in her father's house and supplies for the animals. Her conduct appeared before her genealogy. That order mattered to the servant. If he had learned only that she was Bethuel's daughter, he would have found Abraham's relative. Because he first watched her serve, he found a woman whose actions corresponded to the sign placed before God. The discovery joined family identity with observed character. Rebekah was not present because Abraham had named her in advance. Abraham had named only his country and kindred. The servant had not asked for a particular face, rank, or possession. He had asked for a woman who would respond to his request by caring for the animals as well. Rebekah did exactly that. Now the servant knew where he had been led. He bowed beside the well and blessed the God of Abraham for steadfast love and faithfulness. The language reached back across Abraham's entire journey. God had led Abraham out of his father's house, preserved Sarah, given Isaac, and spared him on the mountain. Now that same faithfulness had guided Abraham's servant back toward the family Abraham once left. The direction had reversed, but the promise had not. Abraham was not returning. Isaac was not returning. The servant had traveled back so that a woman from the family could be invited forward into Canaan. That distinction preserved the movement begun when Abraham left Haran. The covenant household would grow by bringing Rebekah into the promised land, not by relocating Isaac outside it. The meeting at the well had therefore brought the mission to its decisive human threshold. The servant had obeyed the oath. The journey had prospered. Rebekah had appeared. Her identity fit Abraham's command. Her actions fit the servant's prayer. Her household had room to receive him. But Rebekah still stood beside the well as Bethuel's daughter, not Isaac's wife. The servant's worship marked recognition, not completion. He had found the woman. Now her family had to hear why he had come, and Rebekah herself would have to decide whether she would leave with him. Rebekah ran home and told her mother's household what had happened. She had a brother named Laban. He saw the ring and the bracelets on Rebekah's arms. He also heard his sister repeat what the man had said to her. Then Laban went out to the servant, who was still standing beside the camels at the spring. Laban addressed him with words that matched the servant's worship. "Come in, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside? I have prepared the house and a place for the camels." The servant entered the house. The camels were unloaded, and straw and fodder were provided for them. Water was brought so the servant and the men traveling with him could wash their feet. Then food was placed before him. The servant refused to eat until he had explained his purpose. "I will not eat until I have said what I have to say." Laban told him to speak. The servant began with his identity. "I am Abraham's servant." Then he described what the Lord had done for his master. "The Lord has greatly blessed my master, and he has become great. Abraham possessed flocks, herds, silver, gold, male and female servants, camels, and donkeys. The property represented at the well by 10 camels and valuable gifts was only part of the household the servant managed." Then he explained Isaac's place within that wealth. "Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old, and to him he has given all that he has." The family now understood that the proposed marriage concerned Abraham's heir. Isaac was not one son among several sharing the central household. Abraham had given him everything. The servant then described the oath that brought him there. Abraham had made him swear not to take a wife for Isaac from the daughters of the Canaanites, in whose land Abraham lived. The servant had been commanded to go to Abraham's father's house and clan to obtain a wife for his son. He also repeated the question he had asked before leaving. "What if the woman will not follow me?" Abraham's answer had rested on the God who directed his life. "The Lord, before whom I have walked, will send his angel with you and prosper your way." The servant would find a wife for Isaac from Abraham's clan and father's house. If the family refused to give her, the servant would be released from the oath. That condition now placed the decision before the people listening. The servant had fulfilled his responsibility by traveling to Abraham's family. He had found Rebekah. He had entered her home and explained the mission. Her household could release her, or their refusal would free him from the promise he had made. But before asking for their answer, he told them how he had met Rebekah. "I came today to the spring." He had prayed to the Lord, the God of his master Abraham, asking that his journey be made successful. He described the sign he requested. He would stand beside the spring. When a young woman came out to draw water, he would ask for a little water from her jar. The woman who answered by giving him a drink and offering water for his camels would be the wife appointed for Isaac. Then he told them how quickly the answer came. "Before I had finished speaking in my heart, behold, Rebekah came out with her water jar on her shoulder. She went down to the spring and drew water. When the servant asked for a drink, Rebekah gave him one. Then she offered water to his camels. He asked whose daughter she was. She answered that she was the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Nahor, and Milcah. Once he knew her identity, he placed the ring on her nose and the bracelets on her arms. Then he bowed and worshipped the Lord. He blessed the God of Abraham, who had led him by the right way to the daughter of Abraham's kinsman for Isaac. The servant's testimony brought the entire sequence together for Rebekah's family. He had not come to seize a woman or carry out a private bargain with Rebekah at the well. He came under an oath to Abraham. His mission had clear limits. The woman had to come from Abraham's clan, and the family had the ability to refuse. The servant had asked God for guidance before knowing Rebekah's identity. Her actions matched the sign before she named her father. Her genealogy then matched Abraham's command. Now the servant asked the household to respond. "If you are going to show steadfast love and faithfulness to my master, tell me." If they would not, they were to tell him that as well, so he could turn elsewhere. The request did not allow the meeting to remain an impressive coincidence without consequence. The servant required a decision. He had found the right family and the woman whose conduct answered his prayer. Would the family now act with the same steadfast love and faithfulness he believed the Lord had shown Abraham? Laban and Bethuel answered, "The thing has come from the Lord." Because they recognized the divine direction in what the servant described, they said they could not speak to him either bad or good. "Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken." The family gave its consent. Rebekah could leave their household, travel to Canaan, and become Isaac's wife. When Abraham's servant heard their words, he bowed to the ground before the Lord. The mission had crossed another threshold. At the well, the servant worshipped because he found Abraham's kin. Inside the house, he worshipped because the family released Rebekah. Then he brought out jewelry of silver and gold and clothing. He gave them to Rebekah. He also gave valuable gifts to her brother and mother. Only after the mission had been explained and the family had answered, did the servant eat the food set before him. He and the men with him ate and drank, and they spent the night. The household had received them. Gifts had been distributed. Rebekah had been formally given to become Isaac's wife. But when morning came, the question of timing reopened the decision. The servant said, "Send me away to my master." He intended to depart without extending the stay. Rebekah's brother and mother asked for a delay. "Let the young woman remain with us a while, at least 10 days. After that she may go." Their request did not reverse the agreement. They still allowed the marriage and journey. They wanted Rebekah to remain with them before leaving. The servant refused the delay. "Do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master." He understood the successful meeting as a reason to continue promptly. Abraham was waiting in Canaan. The mission had prospered. Rebekah had been identified and released. The servant would not turn completion into an extended pause. The family decided to ask Rebekah. "Let us call the young woman and ask her." This brought her voice into the choice Abraham had identified before the journey began. The servant had said that the woman might be unwilling to follow him. Abraham had answered that unwillingness would release the servant from his oath. Now the family called Rebekah and put that exact question before her. "Will you go with this man?" Rebekah answered, "I will go." Her decision ended the proposed delay. The servant's prayer had identified Rebekah through her voluntary generosity. Her family connection had satisfied Abraham's command. Her father and brother had recognized the matter as coming from the Lord and consented to the marriage. But Rebekah herself now chose the journey. She agreed to leave immediately with a servant she had met the previous evening. She would travel away from her mother's household toward a man she had not met, in a land where Abraham lived as a sojourner. The structure of Abraham's original call appeared again in her decision. Abraham had left his country and kindred for the land God showed him. Rebekah would now leave the same family network and go toward that land. Abraham traveled under a promise that a great nation would come from him. Rebekah traveled toward the son through whom that nation would continue. Her consent moved the covenant household into its next generation without requiring Isaac to abandon Canaan. The family sent Rebekah away with her nurse. They also sent Abraham's servant and his men. Before she departed, they blessed her. Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s. The blessing matched the scale of the promise attached to Abraham. His offspring had been compared to the stars of heaven, the dust of the earth, and the sand on the seashore. Rebekah's family now sent her away with words of extraordinary fruitfulness. They continued, "May your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him." That language also matched the oath pronounced after Isaac's life was spared on the mountain. Abraham's offspring would possess the gate of their enemies. Rebekah's family did not yet know how those promises would unfold, but their blessing placed her within the same future already spoken over Isaac. Rebekah rose with her young women. They mounted the camels and followed the servant. The servant took Rebekah and departed. The young woman who had arrived at the well carrying a jar now left on one of the camels she had watered. Her generosity had identified her before her name did. Her family connection had brought the servant into her home. Her consent now carried her away from it. The journey began with a clear direction. She was going to Abraham's household. She was going to become Isaac's wife. She was going to the land Abraham had refused to let Isaac leave. Everything required for the mission had come together without changing Abraham's terms. The wife came from his kindred. Isaac remained in Canaan. The family agreed. Rebekah was willing. The servant's oath could now be completed not through compromise, but through the exact outcome Abraham had requested. Rebekah carried gifts of jewelry and clothing. Her nurse and young women accompanied her. Abraham's servant led the returning company with the men who had traveled beside him. Behind her stood the household of Bethuel, Laban, and her mother. Ahead stood a husband whose birth had required a miracle and whose life had been returned from an altar. Rebekah knew what the servant had told her family. Abraham had been greatly blessed. Sarah had borne a son in old age, and Abraham had given that son everything he possessed. Isaac knew only that his father had sent a servant to seek a wife from the family Abraham had left. Their lives were now moving toward one another because an oath, a prayer, a meeting at a well, a family decision, and Rebekah's own consent had aligned. The practical future of the promise traveled with her. Isaac had survived so that the covenant line could continue. Rebekah was now on the way to join him. The journey brought Rebekah into the Negeb. Isaac had returned from Beer-lahai-roi and was living in that region. One evening he went out into the field to meditate. When he looked up, he saw camels approaching. Rebekah also looked up. She saw Isaac and dismounted from her camel. "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" she asked the servant. The servant answered, "It is my master." Rebekah took her veil and covered herself. The mission that began with Abraham's oath had reached its destination. The servant had gone to Abraham's family, prayed beside the well, found Rebekah, gained the consent of her household, and returned with the woman who agreed to come. Now Isaac and Rebekah saw each other for the first time. The servant told Isaac everything he had done. Isaac then brought Rebekah into the tent that had belonged to Sarah, his mother. He took Rebekah, and she became his wife. Isaac loved her. He was comforted after his mother's death. Rebekah's arrival answered the immediate need left within the household. Sarah's tent was no longer only connected to death and absence. Isaac brought his wife into it, and a new marriage took its place within the family. Abraham's conditions had been fulfilled without moving Isaac out of Canaan. The servant had gone to the family. Rebekah had come to the land. Isaac remained where Abraham said he must remain. The son spared on the mountain now had a wife through whom his line could continue. Keturah was another wife of Abraham, and she bore him 6 sons, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Those sons extended Abraham's family beyond Isaac and Ishmael. Jokshan became the father of Sheba and Dedan. Dedan's descendants included the Ashurim, the Letushim, and the Leumim. Midian became the father of Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldah. These were the descendants of Keturah. Their names gave visible form to the promise that Abraham would become the father of many nations. His descendants would not remain gathered within one household or one territory. Multiple family lines were already forming through his sons. But the existence of those lines did not blur the distinction God had established around Isaac. Abraham gave all that he possessed to Isaac. The statement defined the central inheritance. Isaac received the estate Abraham had accumulated through his years as a sojourner. The livestock, silver, gold, servants, and possessions placed under the management of the servant who found Rebekah. Isaac also stood in relation to the field and cave at Machpelah, the property Abraham had purchased in Canaan. Abraham made provisions for his other sons as well. While he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines. Then he sent them away from Isaac eastward toward the eastern country. The arrangement combined provision with separation. The other sons did not leave empty-handed. Abraham gave them gifts from his possessions, but they did not remain beside Isaac to divide the central inheritance after Abraham's death. Abraham sent them away during his own lifetime. Isaac remained in the position God had named before his birth. Ishmael had been sent away with Hagar after Sarah declared that he would not share Isaac's inheritance. God preserved him and promised to make him a great nation. The sons connected to Abraham's concubines also received gifts and were sent toward the east. Isaac received everything Abraham designated as the primary inheritance. The same distinction that governed the covenant now governed Abraham's household settlement. God had promised fruitfulness to more than one branch of Abraham's family, but the central line remained with the son born to Sarah. Rebekah's presence made that distribution practical as well as legal. Isaac now had a wife from Abraham's kin. The household Abraham entrusted to him had a path toward another generation. The property Abraham gave him would remain connected to the son whose descendants had been promised Canaan. The other sons could establish their own households away from him with the gifts Abraham supplied. Abraham handled these arrangements while he was alive. The divisions were acts he personally completed, not disputes left for the sons to resolve after his death. He gave, he sent, he distinguished, and Isaac remained. The years of Abraham's life reached 175. Then Abraham breathed his last. He died at a good old age, an old man and full of years. He was gathered to his people. The death came according to the future God had declared when Abraham asked how he would know that his descendants would possess the land. God had told him that he would go to his fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. At 175, that word was fulfilled. Abraham's death brought his two oldest sons together. Isaac and Ishmael buried him. The brothers whose inheritance had required separation now stood together for their father's burial. They placed Abraham in the cave of Machpelah. The cave stood in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre. It was the field Abraham had purchased from the Hittites. The property had first been secured when Sarah died. Abraham had weighed 400 shekels of silver before witnesses at the city gate, so the field, cave, and trees within its boundaries would belong to him. Now the same property received Abraham. The man who had once identified himself to the Hittites as a sojourner and foreigner was buried in ground he owned within Canaan. Isaac and Ishmael completed the burial together. There Abraham was buried beside Sarah, his wife. After Abraham's death, God blessed Isaac, his son. Isaac lived at Beer-lahai-roi, the well whose name remembered the living one who sees. There, beside that well, the son once placed upon the altar remained alive and established under God's blessing.